On the morning of my divorce, my husband slid the settlement papers across the table, leaned back in his $3,000 chair, and told me to take my handbag and go, because without him, I was nothing. His mistress sat in the corner filing her nails, smiling like she'd already won. His lawyers nodded along. Everyone in that glass conference room on the 42nd floor of Thorne Tower was waiting for the trophy wife to cry. I didn't cry. I uncapped my own pen, a plain black thing that cost less than his cufflinks, and I said, "Before you sign, Lawrence, you might want to check who's been holding your company's debt since the third quarter of last year." He laughed. Of course he laughed. "Sweetheart, you don't even know what debt means. You spent 3 years shopping." I slid a single sheet of paper back across the table. It was a creditor's disclosure, the kind his own bank had filed that morning. At the bottom, under the line marked Majority Note Holder, was a name he'd never heard spoken out loud. Ashford Silvercrest Capital. 58% of Thorne Group's outstanding debt. Calling on 30 days' notice. "Congratulations on the divorce," I said. "By the way, I'm withdrawing my investment." Let me back up because the look on his face deserves the full story. My name is Eleanor Vance. For 3 years, the entire city knew me as Nora Thorne, the pretty, quiet wife of Lawrence Thorne, golden heir to the Thorne Group, a mid-tier conglomerate with its fingers in logistics, real estate, and a shipping arm that was quietly hemorrhaging money. The tabloids called me a lucky girl. His mother called me, to my face, at the dinner table, in front of guests, the little nobody my son picked up. His friends assumed I'd married him for the penthouse and the black card. Nobody, and I mean nobody, knew that I was the reason the Thorne Group still had a pulse. 3 years ago, when the shipping arm nearly went under and the banks were circling like they smell blood in the water, a mysterious fund appeared out of nowhere and bought up the group's toxic debt at a premium nobody else would touch. It restructured the loans. It bought them time. Lawrence's father called it a miracle. Lawrence called it proof that the universe loved the Thorne name. The financial press spent a month trying to figure out who was behind Ashford Silvercrest Capital and came up with nothing, because the fund had exactly one client, one analyst, and one decision-maker, and she was sleeping in the guest bedroom of the Thorne penthouse because her husband said her perfume gave him headaches. That analyst was me. I want to be clear about something because people always assume the worst. I didn't marry Lawrence for his money. That's the funniest part of this whole thing. I had more money than the entire Thorne family combined before I ever met him. What I didn't have was a name that anyone would take seriously, because the Vance fortune had been buried on purpose 2 generations back, split into shells and trusts and offshore vehicles by my grandfather after the family war that nearly destroyed us. I grew up rich and invisible, which is a very specific kind of childhood. I learned early that the safest place to keep power is behind other people's faces. So when my grandfather died and left me the keys to a fortune that even I hadn't fully mapped, I did what any reasonable heir raised in the shadows would do. I stayed in the shadows. I ran the money quietly. I made it grow. And when a certain golden boy from a certain over-leveraged family started appearing at the same charity galas as me, charming, careless, drowning in debt he didn't know about yet, I did something I still can't fully explain. I decided to save him. Maybe it was because he was kind to me the first night we met, when I was just a girl in a plain dress who'd wandered onto the wrong balcony. He didn't know who I was. He handed me a glass of champagne and told me the party was full of vultures, and I seemed like the only real person there. For one evening, Lawrence Thorne made me feel like I was more than a bank account with legs. I was young enough and lonely enough that it mattered. I married him 6 months later. And somewhere in the first year, the man who'd handed me champagne on a balcony disappeared and was replaced by the man who told me my perfume gave him headaches. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back to the conference room, where Lawrence Thorne was still holding my creditor's disclosure and slowly turning the color of old paper. "This is fake," he said, but his voice cracked on the word. His lead lawyer, a sharp man named Graham who charged $800 an hour and had never once looked me in the eye, picked up the sheet. I watched him read it. I watched the exact moment his professional composure slipped, just a hairline fracture, because Graham was good at his job and he understood immediately what he was looking at. "Mr. Thorne," Graham said carefully, "we need to verify this before—" "It's verified," I said. "Your bank filed it at 9 this morning. You can call them. I'll wait." The mistress in the corner stopped filing her nails. Her name was Camille Sterling, and she'd spent the last 4 months making sure everyone in Lawrence's circle knew she was the future of the Thorne empire. She was beautiful in the aggressive, well-funded way that money buys, and she'd walked into that conference room draped on Lawrence's arm like a live demonstration of my replacement. When our eyes met earlier, she'd given me a little pitying smile, the kind you give a dog that's about to be put down. Now, she was leaning forward. "Lawrence," she said. "What is she talking about?" "Nothing," Lawrence snapped. "She's bluffing. She doesn't have this kind of money. Her family's broke. I checked before I married her." And there it was. 3 years of marriage, and he'd just admitted, out loud, in front of his lawyers and his mistress, that he'd run a background check on my finances before proposing. That the kind, careless boy on the balcony had been doing math the whole time. I almost admired the honesty of it. "You checked the Vance family," I agreed, "and you found a modest inheritance, a dead grandfather, and a girl with no title and no board seats. That's exactly what you were supposed to find. That's what everyone finds. It's what I paid a very expensive firm to make sure everyone finds." I capped my pen. "You didn't marry a broke girl, Lawrence. You married the majority creditor of your own company. You just didn't know it because I wanted a husband who loved me, not my balance sheet. And for exactly 1 evening on 1 balcony, I thought I'd found one." The room was so quiet I could hear the building's ventilation. "So let's talk about the divorce," I said. "I'll agree to every term in these papers. The penthouse, the cars, the accounts, all of it, it's yours. I don't want any of it. I never needed any of it. Sign wherever you like." I stood, smoothing my very ordinary coat. "But the marriage was the only reason I kept my fund from calling in your debt. It was a wedding gift I never told you about, and you just gave me the divorce papers to end the marriage. So the gift ends too." Lawrence was on his feet now. "You can't do that. You call that debt and the whole group collapses. Thousands of people. Employees I've quietly protected for 3 years while you spent their margins on her," I said, not raising my voice, tilting my head toward Camille. "Don't lecture me about the workers, Lawrence. I'm the only one in this room who's ever actually saved them." I picked up my plain black pen, dropped it into my plain handbag, the same handbag he'd just told me to take and go, and I walked to the door. "You have 30 days, I said without turning around. "I'd suggest you spend them being nicer to people than you were to me." Then I left the 42nd floor of Thorne Tower, took the express elevator down, and stepped out into a morning that felt, for the first time in 3 years, like it belonged to me. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone was already buzzing. Not with Lawrence's number, with the direct line of David Romero, the chief financial officer of Thorne Group, a quiet, careful man who was one of maybe 3 people in that entire company who had always treated me like a human being. I answered. "David." "Mrs. Thorne." A pause. "Or should I say, Nora is fine." "Nora." His voice was low, tight, the voice of a man in a supply closet who doesn't want to be overheard. "The bank just called me. About a creditor disclosure, Ashford Silvercrest." Another pause, longer. "I've spent 3 years wondering who they were, why they saved us, why they never asked for anything. And now you know." Now I know. I heard him exhale. "Nora, whatever you're planning, I need you to understand something. Lawrence is going to do something stupid. He always does something stupid when he's cornered. And the board meeting is in 11 days. If you're going to move, you need to move before then, or he'll have time to find another lifeline." I stopped in the middle of the marble lobby, under the enormous gilded K that Lawrence's grandfather had hung there 50 years ago, and I smiled. "David," I said, "who do you think he's going to call for that lifeline?" Silence on the line. "Every door he knocks on," I said. "I already own the building. Get me the board list. It's time everyone met Ashford Silvercrest in person." The first person Lawrence called was not his lawyer. It was his father. I know this because David told me later, in the careful way he told me everything in those 11 days, feeding me the inside of a company I'd owned in the shadows and never once walked through the front door of as its master. Lawrence burst out of the conference room, phone already against his ear, and by the time he reached his corner office, he was shouting. Arthur Thorne was the kind of man who had built a real business once, decades ago, and then spent the rest of his life letting it slowly rot while he golfed. He was 71, silver-haired, and he had never in 3 years addressed a single word to me that wasn't a command. "Pour the wine, Nora. Fetch my reading glasses, Nora. Smile for the cameras, Nora, you're the pretty part." When Lawrence told him a mystery fund was calling in the company's debt, Arthur's first response, according to the assistant who overheard it, was to laugh and say, "Then buy them off. Everyone has a price." Lawrence said, "Dad, it's Nora. It's Nora's fund." And Arthur Thorne, patriarch of a dying empire, went completely silent for 11 seconds before he said the sentence that told me everything I needed to know about the family I'd married into. "Then we'll take it from her in the divorce. She's just a woman. She won't have thought of the paperwork." I had thought of the paperwork. I had thought of the paperwork 3 years before Arthur Thorne ever imagined he'd need to worry about it. Every dollar that flowed from Ashford Silvercrest into the Thorne Group had flowed through a structure so clean and so cold that 100 lawyers working 100 years couldn't have pried a cent of it loose in a divorce court. The fund wasn't a marital asset. It had never been in my name. It had never been in anyone's name. It was a trust of a trust of a trust. And the only human being on earth with signing authority was a woman they'd spent 3 years asking to pour the wine. But let them try. I wanted them to try. There is a particular pleasure in watching a man reach confidently for a weapon that isn't there. That afternoon, I did not go home to the penthouse. I had already, weeks earlier, quietly moved everything that mattered to me, which was almost nothing, into a modest apartment across the river that no Thorne knew existed. Instead, I went to a building I did own, openly, under one of Ashford's public arms, a slim glass tower downtown where the fund kept its real offices behind a nameplate that said only ASC Advisory. I rode the elevator to the top. I unlocked a corner office I hadn't sat in for months because a good wife was supposed to be home by 6, and I called my people. I had people. That was the thing none of them ever understood. A woman who runs a 9-figure fund alone from the guest bedroom of her husband's penthouse still needs analysts, lawyers, a security team, a network of favors owed and quietly kept. I'd built all of it in the gaps of my marriage, in the hours Lawrence thought I was at the spa. My head of legal was a terrifying woman named Celeste Lim, who had once made a hostile acquirer cry in a deposition. My head of security was a former intelligence officer named Walker, who spoke about 6 words a day and knew everything. And my most trusted electron was a 26-year-old prodigy named Leo, who I'd pulled out of a dead-end bank job and who would have walked into traffic for me. They filed into my office one by one, and for the first time in 3 years, I sat at the head of a table where every single person in the room knew exactly who I was. "Update me," I said. Celeste went first. The disclosure landed clean. Thorne Group is now formally on notice that 58% of their debt is callable in 30 days. Their share price opened down 9%, and it's still falling. 2 of their smaller lenders are already spooked. They smell the call coming and they want out before we trigger it. "Let them out," I said. "Buy their notes, quietly. I want to hold every dollar of that debt before the board meeting, not just the majority." Celeste's mouth curved. "So when you walk into that room, I don't own most of them. I own all of them." I turned to Leo. "The shipping arm?" Leo pulled up a projection on the glass wall. "Still bleeding, but here's the interesting part. I dug into the losses like you asked. It's not the market. The shipping arm's margins are healthy on paper. The money's leaking somewhere between the invoices and the accounts." He hesitated. "Nora, someone inside Thorne has been skimming. For years. Small enough that Arthur never noticed because Arthur never reads anything. Big enough that it explains why the group needed us to save them in the first place." I sat very still. "Do we know who?" I asked. "Not yet. The routing's clever. Shell vendors, fake freight contracts, a consulting fee that doesn't consult. But it all funnels toward one holding company registered 18 months ago." He clicked. A name came up on the glass. Meridian Ashcroft Holdings. Ashcroft. I thought of a beautiful woman filing her nails in the corner of a conference room. I thought of the little pitying smile she'd given me. I thought of Lawrence telling me my perfume gave him headaches, while another woman quietly drained the very company I was bleeding myself dry to keep alive. "Camille," I said softly. "His mistress," Leo confirmed. "Except I don't think she's just his mistress. Meridian was set up before she and Lawrence went public." She wasn't skimming from Thorne because she was sleeping with the heir. She started sleeping with the heir so she could skim from Thorne. She targeted him, Nora, the way you'd target a mark. I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time all day, I laughed. Really laughed. The way I hadn't laughed since a balcony 3 years ago. Because it was perfect. It was so perfect I could have kissed the accountant who found it. For 3 years, I had bled money into a sinking company to protect a man who was cheating on me. And the woman he was cheating on me with had been robbing him the entire time. The great Thorne heir, so proud, so careless, so sure that every woman in his life was there to be used, had been played by both of the women at that conference table. One of them was stealing his future. The other one owned it. The difference was that only one of us was going to walk out of this rich. Celeste, I said, everything Leo just found. I want it documented, notarized, and bulletproof, but we don't use it yet. Celeste raised an eyebrow. We're sitting on proof that the heir's mistress has been embezzling from the company we're about to seize? That's a nuclear option. Why wait? I looked out the window at the K glowing on the tower across the river, the K that Arthur Thorne thought would still be his in the morning. Because a weapon you use in private is just a transaction, I said. A weapon you use in public is a lesson, and I want the whole city in the room when Camille Sterling finds out what she really is. I stood. The board meeting, 11 days. Everyone learns everything at once. Walker, who had said nothing the entire meeting, spoke up from the corner in his flat, quiet voice. Lawrence is going to come looking for you before then, he said. When the panic sets in, he'll want to negotiate, or beg, or threaten. I know, I said. What do you want me to do when he shows up at your door? I picked up my coat, the plain one, the one that had made a whole conference room underestimate me. Let him in, I said. I want to hear what a man says when he thinks he still has cards to play. Lawrence showed up at my door 3 days later, at 11 at night, in the rain, holding a bottle of the wine we'd drunk on our first anniversary. I'll give him this much. He'd done his homework fast. Nobody was supposed to know about the apartment across the river. That he'd found it in 3 days meant he'd hired someone good, which meant he was finally, 3 years too late, taking me seriously. Walker let him in and then stood against the wall by the door like a piece of very alert furniture. Lawrence didn't even notice him. That was always Lawrence's problem. He never noticed the people who could hurt him until they already had. He looked terrible. The golden boy had gone gray around the edges. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes were red, and when he set the wine bottle on my kitchen counter, his hand was shaking. Nora, he said, baby, we need to talk. We're divorced, Lawrence. Or we will be the second you sign. You brought the papers yourself. I haven't signed them. He said it quickly, like it was a gift. I tore them up. There's no divorce. We can fix this. Whatever I did, whatever made you this angry, we can fix it. I looked at this man I'd once loved on a balcony and I felt almost nothing. That was the strangest part of the whole thing. I'd spent 3 years expecting that when this moment finally came, I'd feel triumphant, or vindicated, or at least sad. Instead, I mostly felt tired, the way you feel when a fever finally breaks and you realize how long you've been sick. You think I'm doing this because I'm angry, I said. Aren't you? He took a step closer. Look, the Camille thing, that was a mistake. It meant nothing. She threw herself at me. You know how these girls are. They see the name and they lose their minds. But you're my wife. You're the one I chose. We can go back to how it was. How it was, I repeated. You mean the guest bedroom. My perfume gave you headaches. He had the decency to flinch. I was stressed. The company I was saving, I said, while you slept in the master bedroom with a woman who was robbing you blind. That stopped him. What? And here is where I made a decision I'd think about for a long time afterward. I could have told him. I could have handed Lawrence Thorne the file that proved his mistress had been embezzling from his family's company for 18 months, that she'd targeted him on purpose, that the great love affair he'd blown up his marriage for was a heist with lipstick. I could have watched his world crack open right there in my kitchen. But I remembered what I'd told Celeste. A weapon you use in private is just a transaction. So instead I said, ask her where she was on the nights the shipping invoices got signed. Ask her what Meridian Holdings is. Then come back and tell me it meant nothing. He stared at me. How do you know about... He stopped. His face did something complicated. You've been investigating her. I've been investigating everything, Lawrence, for 3 years. I know your company better than you know your own name. I know which vendors are real and which ones are ghosts. I know your father golfs on the days the auditors come. I know you cried at your grandmother's funeral and then checked your phone during the eulogy. I set down my tea. You married a woman you never once bothered to actually look at. That was your mistake, not the affair. The affair is just how everyone found out. He was quiet for a long moment. The rain tapped at the windows. You're really going to call the debt, he said. Not a question anymore. Yes. It'll destroy us. My father, the name, everything my grandfather built. Your grandfather built it, I agreed. Your father let it rot. And you spent your inheritance on wine and mistresses, while a stranger you'd insulted at your own dinner table quietly kept the lights on. So no, Lawrence, I'm not destroying anything. I'm just leaving. Everything that falls down when I go was already broken. I was the only thing holding it up, and you told me to take my handbag and get out. He changed then. I watched it happen. The begging drained out of his face and something uglier came in, the thing that had always been under the charm, the thing the balcony boy had hidden so well. You ungrateful. He caught himself. Do you have any idea what I gave you? I made you somebody. Before me, you were nothing, a nobody with a dead grandfather. I gave you my name. I put you in front of cameras. Every good thing in your life came from me, and this is how you— Walker, I said quietly. Walker peeled off the wall. Lawrence finally noticed him. His mouth snapped shut. Mr. Thorne is leaving, I said. He can take his wine. We won't be drinking it. Walker opened the door. Lawrence looked at me one more time, and for just a second, under the fury, I saw genuine fear. He was starting to understand, really understand, that the quiet woman he'd spent 3 years ignoring held his entire life in her hand, and that he had given her every possible reason to close her fist. This isn't over, he said. No, I agreed. The board meeting's in 8 days. It's barely started. He left. Walker closed the door. I stood in my small kitchen in the apartment nobody was supposed to know about, and I poured the wine down the sink. And I did not feel triumphant, and I did not feel sad. I felt like a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for existing. The next morning, Arthur Thorne began making calls. I knew every one of them before he made it, because Walker had spent 3 years mapping the Thorne family's entire financial network, and there was not a single lender, investor, or white knight in the city that Arthur could reach who didn't have some thread running back, however invisibly, to Ashford Silvercrest. He called First Meridian Bank. First Meridian had, 2 years earlier, sold a distressed loan book to an entity called Crestline Partners. Crestline Partners was mine. He called the Hargrove family old money, the kind of people who bailed out failing empires for sport. What Arthur didn't know was that the Hargrove family office had 8 months ago taken a large and very quiet position in a fund of funds. That fund of funds was mine. One phone call from me, and the Hargroves suddenly remembered a scheduling conflict. He called a sovereign investment arm that occasionally rescued mid-cap conglomerates. Their regional director owed his entire career to a recommendation letter written years ago by a woman he'd never met, on the advice of a fund he'd never been able to identify. He took Arthur's call. He listened politely. And then he passed. Every door Arthur Thorne knocked on, I already owned the building. Just like I'd told David in the lobby. By the 4th day, Arthur stopped calling people and started drinking. By the 6th day, the Thorne Group's share price had fallen so far that trading was halted twice. By the 7th day, the financial press had figured out that the mysterious Ashford Silvercrest Capital was about to call the largest debt in the company's history, and the whole city was asking the same question the whole city had asked 3 years ago. Who is behind Ashford Silvercrest? And I decided that on the 8th day, at the Thorne Group board meeting, in front of every director, every lawyer, every reporter who could squeeze into the room, I would finally answer that question myself. Camille Sterling found me 2 days before the board meeting. She was smarter than Lawrence, I'll grant her that. She didn't come with wine and apologies. She came to my office, the real one, the ASC Advisory Tower downtown, and she talked her way past the front desk using a name and a confidence that had opened 1,000 doors for her. Leo buzzed me in a panic. I told him to send her up. I was curious what a professional would say to me. She walked into my corner office in a coat that cost more than most people's cars, and she looked around at the glass and the light and the quiet, expensive power of it, and I watched her recalculate everything she'd assumed about the trophy wife she'd pitied in a conference room. "Well," she said, sitting down without being asked, "you're not what I expected." "Neither are you," I said. "Most women who marry into money at least wait until they're married. You started stealing before you'd even moved in." She didn't flinch. That impressed me a little. "So you know about Meridian?" "I know about Meridian. I know about the freight contracts. I know about the consulting fee that doesn't consult. I know you set the whole thing up before you ever let Lawrence buy you a drink, which means you didn't fall for a rich heir. You went hunting for a leaky company, and you found the leakiest one in the city." I folded my hands. "Honestly, Camille, in another life I might have hired you. You're wasted on Lawrence." For the first time, something real flickered across her face. "Then let's talk like professionals. You're going to call the debt. The group collapses. Fine. But collapses are messy, and messy means audits, and audits mean somebody eventually notices Meridian. That's bad for me. But here's the thing." She leaned forward. "It's bad for you too. Because when the auditors go digging, they don't just find my little operation. They find 3 years of a mystery fund propping up a doomed company for no reason a rational investor would ever accept. They find you, Nora, and people start asking why. Why would a brilliant, invisible heiress bleed a fortune into a sinking business run by a man who kept her in the guest bedroom?" She smiled, and it was a good smile, a smile with teeth. "The answer is embarrassing, isn't it? You did it for love. The great Ashford Silvercrest, the fund nobody could crack, and it turns out she's just a girl who couldn't stop bailing out a husband who didn't want her. That's the story that comes out, not the ice queen, the fool." She sat back, pleased with herself. It was, I had to admit, a genuinely good play. She'd found the one soft place in my armor and pressed it with real skill. So I let her sit in her victory for exactly 5 seconds before I opened the drawer of my desk and set a folder in front of her. "Open it," I said. She opened it. I watched her read. I watched the good smile die. "That's a wire," I said. $240,000 from Meridian Ashcroft Holdings to a private account in your mother's maiden name, dated 6 weeks ago. That's the account you were going to disappear into after you'd milked Lawrence dry. You weren't planning to marry him, Camille. You were planning to gut the company, take the cash, and vanish, and leave him holding a smoking crater with your lipstick on the rim." I turned a page for her. "Here's the thing about your theory that an audit hurts us both. You assume I'm afraid of my own story coming out. I'm not. I bled a fortune into a doomed company for a man I loved, and then I stopped. That's not an embarrassing story. In this city, that's a legend. Women will name daughters after me." I closed the folder. "But your story, the con artist who targeted a family, robbed them for 18 months, and was 3 weeks from vanishing with the cash? That one ends with your face on the news and your accounts frozen, and a very long conversation with people who wear badges. So let's compare fears. Mine is that I look romantic. Yours is that you look like exactly what you are." The room was very quiet. "What do you want?" Camille said finally, flat, all the teeth gone. "I want you at the board meeting," I said. "Front row, next to Lawrence, smiling." I stood and walked to the window. "You're going to sit there and watch me take the company apart, and you're not going to say a single word, because the moment you open your mouth, that folder goes to the authorities. And when it's over, you're going to disappear the way you always planned, just with none of the money. Consider it the fee for the lesson." "And Lawrence?" she said. "What happens to him?" I looked at her reflection in the glass. This beautiful, ruthless woman who had, in her own way, been used by the Thorne name just as much as I had. "Lawrence finds out that both of the women in his life were smarter than him," I said. "That's the whole tragedy of a man like Lawrence. He spent his life surrounded by people he was too proud to see clearly, and it cost him everything. And even at the end, he won't understand why." I turned back to her. "You can go now, Camille. I'll see you Thursday. Front row." She stood. At the door, she paused, and without turning around, she said something I didn't expect. "He really did keep you in the guest bedroom?" "For 2 years, I said. She was quiet for a second. "Then he deserves every bit of it." And she left. The day before the board meeting, Lawrence's mother came to see me. Beatrice Thorne had spent 3 years treating me like hired help. She'd corrected my posture at dinner parties. She'd introduced me to guests as Lawrence's little wife. She's very sweet. Don't ask her about anything important. She'd once, at a gala in front of 40 people, told me the dress I was wearing made me look like I was trying too hard, which, coming from a woman covered in a decade of over-leveraged jewelry, was almost funny. She came to my office in her best suit, and she sat down across from me, and this proud, vicious woman, who had never once said a kind word to me, put her manicured hands flat on my desk and said, "Please." I let the words sit in the air. "I know I wasn't warm to you," Beatrice said. Her voice was tight, every syllable costing her something. "The family has been under pressure. We didn't always show you the respect you—" She stopped. Started again. "Ellerning, whatever my son did, whatever that woman did, the family isn't only them. There are cousins. There are grandchildren. There are people who will lose everything if you call that debt. I'm asking you, as a mother, to have mercy." 3 years ago, that speech might have worked on me. 3 years ago, I still wanted these people to love me. "Beatrice," I said gently, "do you remember my grandmother's necklace?" She blinked. "What?" "The pearl necklace I wore to your anniversary gala. The one you told me looked cheap. You said, and I remember this exactly, 'Sweetheart, if you can't afford real pearls, don't wear costume ones. It reflects on the family.'" I smiled at her. "Those pearls were real, Beatrice. They belonged to my grandmother, who was quietly one of the wealthiest women this country ever produced. That necklace is worth more than your entire jewelry collection. But you looked at me, a girl you'd decided was beneath you, and you saw costume pearls, because you only ever saw what you'd already decided was there." I leaned forward. "That was your family's mistake, not cruelty. Blindness. You had a fortune sitting at your dinner table for 3 years, pouring your wine, and you never once looked closely enough to see it. So no, I won't have mercy, but I'll tell you what I'll do, because I'm not the monster your son thinks I am. When it's all over, the employees keep their jobs. The pensions are safe. The cousins and the grandchildren won't starve. I'll see to it, because I always have. The only people who lose everything are the ones who told me to take my handbag and go." I stood. "You should get some rest, Beatrice. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She left without another word. But at the door, she stopped and she looked at me, really looked at me, for what I think was the first time in 3 years. "The pearls were real," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was a woman finally seeing the thing that had been in front of her all along. "Everything about me was real," I said. "You just never checked." The night before the board meeting, I couldn't sleep, so I went back to the ASC tower, and I sat alone in my corner office with all the lights off and the city burning below me, and I did the thing I'd promised myself I'd do exactly once before it was over. I let myself feel it. For 3 years, I hadn't let myself feel any of it. You can't run a 9-figure fund out of a guest bedroom while your husband tells you your perfume gives him headaches if you let yourself feel things. Feeling things is a luxury of people who are safe, and I had never once been safe. So I'd frozen it all. Every insult, every dismissal, every night in the guest bedroom listening to him laugh with someone else through the wall, every dinner where his mother introduced me as nothing, and I smiled and poured the wine. I'd taken all of it and I'd packed it into ice, because ice doesn't hurt, and ice doesn't break, and ice, if you're patient, if you're very, very patient, can sink a ship. But the night before I walked into that boardroom and took their empire apart, I let the ice melt, just for a few hours, alone in the dark, because I didn't want to do the biggest thing of my life while I was still frozen. I wanted to do it awake. I wanted to feel every ounce of what they'd cost me, so that when I sat in that chair I would know exactly, precisely in my body, what I was taking back and why. I thought about the girl on the balcony, the one in the plain dress who'd wandered onto the wrong terrace and been handed a glass of champagne by a boy who said she seemed like the only real person at the party. I thought about how much she'd wanted it to be true. How lonely a rich, invisible girl has to be to marry the first person who ever looked at her like she was a person instead of a vault. I didn't hate that girl, sitting in the dark. I used to. I used to think she was stupid, weak, a genius who'd let herself be fooled by the oldest trick there is. But that night I finally forgave her, because I understood that she hadn't been fooled by his charm. She'd been fooled by her own hunger to be seen, and there is nothing weak about being hungry to be seen. It's the most human thing there is. It's the thing my whole family had starved itself of for 60 years in the name of staying safe. My phone lit up. A message from David. He'd stayed late too, 2 floors down in the Thorne Tower, doing the honest work of reconciling the note holdings one final time so that when Albright or anyone else demanded verification the next day, the numbers would be unbreakable. The message said only, "The reconciliation's clean. Every dollar accounted for. You're going to walk in there tomorrow and tell the truth, and the truth is going to hold, because I checked it myself. Get some sleep, Nora. You've been carrying this alone for 3 years. Tomorrow you get to put it down. I read it 4 times. You've been carrying this alone for 3 years." No one had ever said that to me. No one had ever even known it was true. And a man 2 floors away, in the tower of the family that had spent 3 years looking through me, had seen it clearly enough to name it, at midnight, on the eve of the thing that would change both our lives. I texted back one word: "Thank you." And then, because the ice was melted and I was awake and I'd promised myself I'd feel it, I added a second message I would never have sent frozen. For seeing it. Nobody else ever did. His reply came a minute later. "Somebody always would have, eventually. I just got lucky enough to be early." I put the phone down. I looked out at the city one more time, at the K glowing on the tower where a man was reconciling numbers in the dark so that a woman he'd never once mistaken for nobody could take back what was hers. And for the first time in 3 years, the ice was gone, and I wasn't frozen, and I wasn't afraid, and I understood that I was going to win, not because I was colder than them, but because underneath all the ice I'd needed to survive them, I had never actually stopped being warm. That was the thing they'd never understand. They thought the Ice Queen was made of ice. She was made of everything she'd had to freeze to survive people who couldn't see her. And in the morning, all of it, every frozen ounce, was going to melt at once, into a boardroom, as the truth. I slept 2 hours. It was enough. I've never needed much on the mornings that matter. The Thorne Group board meeting was held in the same 42nd floor conference room where Lawrence had told me to take my handbag and go. I thought that was a nice touch. I hadn't planned it, but Arthur had insisted on the home field advantage, on holding the meeting in the tower with his family's name over the door, as if the building itself would protect him. Men like Arthur always believe the symbols will save them. They spend their whole lives confusing the crown for the kingdom. I arrived 20 minutes late, on purpose. I wanted them all seated when I walked in. The room was packed. All 9 board members were there, gray men and 2 gray women who had spent decades approving Arthur's bad decisions in exchange for a director's fee and a good table at the holiday party. Graham the lawyer was there, and 2 more like him. David Romero sat at the far end, quiet, his hands folded, and when I caught his eye, he gave me the smallest nod. Lawrence sat near the head of the table looking like he hadn't slept in a week. And in the front row of the observer seats, exactly where I'd told her to be, sat Camille Sterling, front row, next to the empty chair meant for Lawrence, smiling a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. And behind the glass wall at the back, in the overflow area, were the reporters. A dozen of them. Because the whole city wanted to know who was about to either save or bury the Thorne Group. And today, they were finally going to find out. I walked in wearing the plain coat. I want to be clear about that. I could have worn anything. I could have arrived in couture, in a power suit, in the full armor of the woman I actually was. Instead, I wore the same unremarkable coat I'd worn to the divorce meeting, the coat that had made a whole room decide I was nobody, because I wanted every person in that room to remember that they had looked at this exact woman in this exact coat and decided she didn't matter. I did not sit in the observer seats. I walked to the head of the table, to the empty chair at the very top, the chairman's chair, Arthur's chair, and I put my plain handbag down on the polished wood in front of it. "You're in the wrong seat," Arthur said. His voice shook. "That's the chairman's chair." "I know," I said, and I sat down in it. The room made a sound. Not a word, just a collective intake of breath, the sound a room makes when it realizes the ground has shifted. "For those of you who don't know me," I said, "my name is Eleanor Vance. Some of you know me as Nora Thorne, Lawrence's wife, the quiet girl who poured the wine at the holiday party." I opened my handbag and took out a single thin folder. "But the name you actually need to know is the one on this." I set the folder on the table and slid it toward the center. Ashford Silvercrest Capital. I founded it. I run it. I am its only principal. And as of this morning, it holds not 58%, but 100% of the outstanding debt of the Thorne Group. I spent the last 8 days buying the rest. Silence. Absolute, total silence. 3 years ago, I continued, this company was 30 days from insolvency. The shipping arm was bleeding out. The banks were done. And a fund appeared from nowhere and saved you. You called it a miracle. It wasn't a miracle. It was me. I bought your debt because I had just married your golden son, and I wanted to protect the family I thought I was joining. I have quietly carried this company on my back for 3 years. Every quarter you thought you survived because I decided you would. I looked down the table at Arthur. You never knew. None of you. You had your savior pouring your wine and correcting her posture, and you never once looked up. One of the gray directors, a man named Albright, found his voice. This is highly irregular. We need independent verification that the debt has been consolidated as you claim. David, I said. David Romero stood up. As chief financial officer, he was the one man in the room whose word on the numbers no one could dismiss. It's verified, he said, and his voice was steady. I reconciled the note holdings myself last night. Every dollar of Thorne Group debt is now held by a single creditor, Ashford Silvercrest. Ms. Vance is telling the truth. He paused, and then he added something he did not have to add, something that I would remember for a long time. And for the record, she's been telling the truth about this company longer than anyone else at this table. Arthur turned on him. You knew? You knew who she was and you didn't. I found out 8 days ago, David said. Same as all of you. The difference is, I wasn't surprised. Because I'm the only one here who ever actually read the numbers. And the numbers have been quietly saving your life for 3 years, Arthur. I just never had a name to put to them until now. I let that land. Then I opened the second folder. Now, I said, let's talk about why this company needed saving in the first place. Because it wasn't the market. The market was fine. This company has been bleeding from an internal wound for 18 months, and I found it. I slid the folder to the center of the table next to the first. Meridian Ashcroft Holdings, a shell company, fake freight contracts, ghost vendors, a consulting fee paid monthly to a consultant who does not exist. Just under $9 million siphoned out of the shipping arm in a year and a half, router through accounts that eventually terminate in a private account held under a maiden name. I looked up, straight into the front row. The maiden name of Camille Sterling's mother. Every head in the room turned to the front row. Camille did not move. She sat there, front row, exactly where I'd put her, and she smiled her dead smile, and she said nothing. Because she knew that the second she opened her mouth, the folder in my desk went to the authorities. She was, in that moment, the most powerful demonstration of my point that I could have staged. The heir's great love, the woman he'd blown up his marriage for, sitting silent and trapped while I read out the record of her theft, unable to defend herself because every defense was a confession. Lawrence made a sound, a small, broken sound. He was looking at Camille like a man watching a photograph develop into something he didn't recognize. Cam, he said, tell them it's not true. She looked at him, and she said nothing at all, which was, of course, the loudest possible answer. She targeted this company, I said, almost gently, because there was no need to be cruel now. The facts were doing all the work. She targeted your son because he was the softest way in. The affair wasn't a betrayal of a marriage, Arthur. It was a business plan. Your family spent 3 years despising me, the quiet nobody who was keeping you alive, while you welcomed into your home the beautiful stranger who was robbing you. You had it exactly backwards. You always did. I closed the folder. That's the real Thorne tragedy. Not that the company is failing. It's that every single one of you spent 3 years being kind to the people destroying you and cruel to the only person who wasn't. I let the room sit in that for a moment. Then I got to the part they were all actually afraid of. So here's what happens now, I said. I hold all of your debt. I can call it this afternoon. If I do, the Thorne Group is insolvent by Monday. The name over the door comes down. The tower gets sold to cover the notes. Every director at this table loses their fee, their seat, and the last shred of their reputation, because the story that comes out isn't market conditions. The story that comes out is that the Thorne board sat on its hands for 3 years while a con artist looted the company and a genius quietly bailed it out, and none of you noticed either one. I paused. That's option 1, and I'll be honest with you. Part of me wants it. Part of me has wanted it since the night your golden boy told me my perfume gave him headaches. Nobody breathed. But I'm not going to do that, I said, because there are 4,000 people who work for this company who never once told me to take my handbag and go. There are drivers and dock workers and accountants and assistants who have families, and they did nothing wrong except work for men who couldn't see straight. I've protected them for 3 years in the dark. I'm not going to stop protecting them now just to enjoy the sound of this building coming down. I opened the last folder. So here is option 2, and it isn't a request. I slid the document down the table. It was a term sheet. Celeste had spent 2 days making it perfect. I'm converting the debt to equity, I said. All of it. As of the vote you're about to take, Ashford Silvercrest owns a controlling interest in the Thorne Group. The name stays. The jobs stay. The pensions are guaranteed, personally, by me. The company survives. I looked at Arthur. But it survives under new management. Arthur Thorne resigns as chairman, effective immediately. Lawrence Thorne resigns from the board and from every operating role, effective immediately. Neither of them will hold any position in this company again. And I take the chairman's seat, the one I'm already sitting in. Arthur shot to his feet. You can't just seize a family company because you... I'm not seizing anything, I said. I'm calling in a debt you can't pay and accepting equity instead of cash, which is more mercy than any other creditor on earth would show you. The board can vote it down if they like, and then I call the debt this afternoon and you all lose everything by Monday. So please, Arthur, vote it down. I'd love to watch. Arthur looked around the table for allies. He found none. The 9 gray directors were doing the math that gray directors always do, the only math they'd ever really cared about, which was the math of their own survival. Option 1, total ruin and public disgrace. Option 2, keep your seat, keep your fee, keep your reputation, and answer to a new chairman. It wasn't a hard vote. Albright cleared his throat. I move to accept the conversion and the leadership changes as presented. Second, said one of the gray women, not quite meeting Arthur's eyes. All in favor, I said. Every hand at the table went up except Arthur's. The motion carries, I said. Welcome to the new Thorne Group. My first act as chairman is to thank you all for your service and to inform you that 4 of you will be replaced within the quarter, because a board that sat still for 3 years is a board that needs new blood. I'll let you spend the next few weeks wondering which 4. I stood finally out of the chairman's chair, and I picked up my plain handbag. David Romero is your new chief executive, effective today. He's the only person in this building who ever did his job honestly, and I intend to reward that, because I run companies the opposite way this family did. I promote the people who tell me the truth, and I remove the people who told me to pour the wine. David looked genuinely stunned. I hadn't warned him. I'd wanted the board to see his face and know it was real, know that I wasn't installing a puppet, that I was elevating the one honest man in a room full of blind ones. Lawrence stood up. He was shaking. You planned all of this, from the beginning. The marriage, the fund, all of it. You married me to take my company. And here, finally, I gave him the truth, because he'd earned at least that. No, Lawrence, I said. That's the part you'll never be able to live with. I didn't marry you for the company. I married you because you handed me a glass of champagne on a balcony and made me feel like a person instead of a bank account. I saved this company because I loved you. You specifically, the man I thought you were. For 3 years, I poured a fortune into this sinking building for exactly one reason. I didn't want the man I loved to lose the thing he thought made him worth loving. I felt my throat tighten, just slightly, and I let it, because there was no shame in it anymore. You didn't lose the company because I planned to take it. You lost the company because you spent 3 years teaching me, very patiently, day after day, that the man from the balcony was never real. The moment I finally believed you, there was nothing left to save. So I stopped saving it. That's the whole story. You talked me out of loving you, and it turned out my love was the only thing holding your entire world together. The room was silent. Somewhere behind the glass, a reporter was crying, which I thought was a bit much, but it would make excellent copy. You did this to yourself, I said quietly. "Every cruel little day of it. I just stopped catching you." I walked to the door. I stopped, the way I had 8 days ago, and I did not turn around. "The company's in good hands now," I said. "For the first time in a long time." And I left the 42nd floor of Thorne Tower for the second time in 8 days, except this time, the name over the door was, in every way that mattered, mine. The story broke before I reached the lobby. By the time I stepped out from under the gilded K, my phone had 41 missed calls, and the whole city knew that Ashford Silvercrest, the fund nobody could crack, was a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had been married to the Thorne heir the entire time and had just taken his family's company in front of a room full of witnesses. The headline that ran that evening would follow me for years. "The wife who owned the empire." Beneath it, a photograph some clever reporter had dug up from a Thorne charity gala 2 years earlier. Me in the background, slightly out of focus, holding a tray of champagne I'd picked up to be helpful, while Beatrice Thorne posed in the foreground in her over-leveraged diamonds. The internet did the rest. Within a day, that image was everywhere. The billionaire heiress serving drinks at her own party, invisible in plain sight, and a whole city that had never once noticed me decided overnight that I was the most interesting woman alive. I didn't read most of it. I'd spent 3 years being invisible on purpose. I wasn't going to spend the next 3 drunk on being seen. But I'll admit, there was one small, human part of me that watched Beatrice Thorne's carefully built social standing evaporate in real time and felt something warm and uncharitable and entirely earned. The work started immediately. Taking a company is loud. Fixing one is quiet and endless, and it's where I actually lived. I moved into the 40th floor of Thorne Tower, 2 floors below the chairman's suite I refused to use because it still smelled like Arthur's cigars. And I got to work with David and a small team I trusted. The company was worse than even I had known from the outside. The shipping arm, once Camille's siphon was clamped shut, turned out to be genuinely salvageable, which meant the theft had been the whole disease. The real estate holdings were mismanaged but sound. And underneath the rot, there were good people, hundreds of them, mid-level managers and engineers and logistics minds who'd spent years watching the Kingsleys drive the company into the ground and had kept it moving anyway out of nothing but professional pride. Those were the people I promoted. I gutted the executive floor and filled it from below, and within a month, the mood in the building had changed so completely that people who'd worked there a decade said they didn't recognize it. David was extraordinary. I'd known he was honest. I hadn't fully understood from the outside how good he was, how much of the company's survival in the dark years had quietly been him holding things together with careful hands while the family looted the estate. We worked late, most nights, the 2 of us and a whiteboard and terrible takeout, and somewhere in the 3rd week I noticed that I looked forward to it, the late nights, in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in a very long time. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to tell this part badly. David never once, in all those late nights, made it into something it wasn't. He didn't flatter me, he didn't hover. When he disagreed with me, he said so, plainly, which after 3 years of a husband who'd only ever wanted me to pour the wine was so novel it made me lightheaded. One night, around the 5th week, we were arguing about the pension guarantee, and I said something sharp, sharper than I meant, the old reflex of a woman used to being dismissed, bracing to be dismissed again. And David just looked at me and said, "You don't have to fight me. I'm already on your side. You can put the armor down in this room." I didn't have an answer for that. I'd worn the armor so long I'd forgotten it came off. "I'm not used to that," I said finally. "I know," he said. "That's the part that makes me angry. Not what Lawrence did, what Lawrence made normal for you." And then he went back to the pension numbers, and he never mentioned it again, and that was somehow the kindest thing anyone had done for me in years, the not mentioning, the letting it be true without making it a thing I owed him for. I was not ready for anything. I want that on the record. A woman does not walk out of a marriage like mine and into someone's arms. That's a story men write about women, not a thing that actually happens to a person with a working heart. But I noticed him. For the first time in 3 years, I noticed a man being decent to me, and I let myself simply notice it, without deciding what it had to mean, and that was its own small kind of freedom. Lawrence, meanwhile, was not taking his defeat quietly. I'd expected that. Walker had warned me the day I took the company. Men like Lawrence don't disappear, he'd said. They regroup. Watch for the counterpunch. And 3 weeks after the board meeting, the counterpunch came. And it came from a direction I should have seen sooner, because it came wearing a very expensive suit and a very familiar smile. His name was Victor Cross, and he wanted my company. Victor Cross was the kind of predator that men like Arthur Thorne told bedtime stories about. He ran a raider fund 3 times the size of anything I managed openly, though of course nobody knew the real size of what I managed, and he had built his fortune the way sharks build theirs, by finding wounded companies and taking them apart for the pieces. When the Thorne story broke, when the whole city learned that a mid-cap conglomerate had just changed hands in a single dramatic morning, Cross smelled exactly what he always smelled. Transition, disruption, a company mid-swallow, vulnerable. He requested a meeting. I took it because you always take the meeting. You learn more from an enemy across a table than from 100 reports. He came to my office on the 40th floor, and he was charming in the practiced, weaponized way that Lawrence had only ever imitated. He complimented the view. He complimented my remarkable maneuver. He sat down across from me and laced his fingers and said, "Ms. Vance, I'm going to save us both a great deal of time. You've done something extraordinary and something exhausting. Taking a company is thrilling. Running one is a grind. And you're about to discover that a conglomerate this size is a hungry, ungrateful animal that will eat the next 10 years of your life. So let me make you an offer. Sell me the Thorne Group. I'll pay a premium that makes you richer than the maneuver ever will, and you walk away a legend with clean hands, and I do the boring work of dismantling it. Everybody wins." "Everybody except the 4,000 employees you'd fire for the pieces," I said. He smiled. "You're sentimental. That's charming, but it's not a strategy. Sentiment is what sank the Kingsleys. Don't let it sink you." He leaned forward. "I'll be blunt, since you seem to appreciate it. I'm going to acquire this company one way or another. I'd prefer to do it by writing you a very large check. But if you'd rather fight, understand who you're fighting. I have relationships you don't have. Lenders, regulators, board members at institutions you need. I can make the next year of your life a war on 40 fronts. You've never run a company under siege. I've done it a dozen times. You're brilliant, Ms. Vance, genuinely. But you're a debut, and I'm a career." He stood, buttoning his jacket. "Think about the check. It's the kind of number that lets a woman like you never wear that plain little coat again unless she wants to." He'd noticed the coat. Of course he had. Cross noticed everything. It was what made him dangerous. After he left, Walker came in and set a folder on my desk without a word, the way he did when he'd found something I needed to see. I opened it. Victor Cross had already met with Lawrence Thorne. Twice. That was the counterpunch. Lawrence couldn't beat me alone, so he'd gone looking for a bigger predator and offered himself as bait. The two of them had a plan, and the plan was elegant, I'll give it that. Cross would mount a hostile campaign for the Thorne Group, pressuring my lenders, courting my new board, painting me in the press as an inexperienced, revenge-driven amateur who'd stumbled into a company she couldn't run. And Lawrence would feed him everything. The family's old relationships, the skeletons, the pressure points. 3 years of watching me from the inside, even if he'd never once actually seen me. In exchange, when Cross won, Lawrence would be installed back at the top of the ruins of his own name, a figurehead heir on a raider's leash, which was, I thought, a fittingly small ambition for a fittingly small man. He didn't even want the empire back. He just wanted me not to have it. I sat with that for a while, and I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt grateful, because Victor Cross had just made a mistake that Lawrence would never have been smart enough to make on his own. He'd underestimated me the exact same way everyone always did. And worse, he'd told me his whole strategy to my face, thinking that naming the war would frighten me out of fighting it. Men like Cross believed that power announced was power doubled. They'd never learned what I'd learned in a childhood spent invisible, that the most powerful thing in any room is the thing nobody's counting. Cross thought he was fighting a debut against a career. He didn't know he was fighting a woman who had run a 9-figure fund alone, in total secrecy, from the guest bedroom of a man who despised her for 3 years and never once got caught. He didn't know that everything he'd built openly, loudly, with his name on it, I'd already learned to build in the dark. He didn't know that while he was busy being visible, I had spent my entire life mastering the one art he'd never needed to learn: being underestimated. Walker, I said, closing the folder, how much of Cross's own fund do you think we could quietly map in 3 weeks? For the first time since I'd known him, Walker almost smiled. His raises are private, he said, but private isn't invisible. Not to us. Give me the 3 weeks. Take 2, I said. Cross wants a war on 40 fronts. Fine. But he made one mistake when he sat in that chair. He told me he has relationships I don't have. I turned to the window, to the city full of buildings whose ownership almost nobody had ever managed to trace. He assumed that because he can't see my relationships, I don't have any. That's the same mistake Lawrence made, the same mistake Arthur made, the same mistake every single one of them makes. I watched the light move across the glass. They keep confusing invisible with absent, and it keeps costing them everything. The war started the way Cross promised, on 40 fronts at once. He was good. I never let myself forget that, not for a single day of it. Within a week, 3 of my inherited lenders got nervous phone calls from institutions that owed Cross favors, hinting that backing an unproven chairwoman was a reputational risk. A financial columnist who dined regularly at Cross's table wrote a long, elegant piece questioning whether the revenge-driven Vance takeover could survive contact with an actual balance sheet. 2 of my remaining Gray Board members, the ones I hadn't yet replaced, started missing meetings and returning my calls slowly, which is how Gray men tell you they're taking another buyer's calls. And every few days, some small, expensive irritation would surface, a supplier suddenly demanding cash up front, a regulatory inquiry into a routine filing, a leak to the press about internal friction that didn't exist until the leak invented it. It was, I had to admire, a masterclass. Cross wasn't trying to win a single decisive battle. He was trying to make running the company feel like drowning, so that one morning I'd wake up exhausted enough to take his check just to make it stop. That was the real weapon. Not any one attack, the accumulation, the grind he'd promised me. So I did the thing he wasn't expecting. I didn't defend all 40 fronts. Amateurs defend everything. Cross was counting on me to be an amateur, to run frantically from fire to fire until I collapsed. Instead, I let some of the fires burn. The nervous suppliers, the missing board members, the ugly columns, I let them go, absorbed them, refused to bleed energy on noise. Walker and Celeste and I spent those weeks doing only one thing, quietly, patiently, the way I'd done everything my whole life. We mapped Victor Cross's fund. Because here was the thing about a raider like Cross. He was loud about his wins and silent about his structure, and he assumed that silence was safety. But every fund, no matter how private, is a web of investors, and investors are people, and people have histories, and I had spent a lifetime learning to read the histories that the loud men never bothered to check. It took Walker 9 days, not even the 2 weeks I'd given him, to bring me the map. And the map had a soft spot. Cross's largest single investor, the anchor that his entire fund was built around, was a pension consortium that managed retirement money for 100,000 public workers. It was conservative, cautious, allergic to scandal, the kind of money that would flee a manager at the first whiff of impropriety. Cross had courted them for years to land them. They were the respectability that made his raids look legitimate. And they had a rule, buried in their investment mandate, that Cross had almost certainly forgotten, because men like Cross never read the fine print of the money that trusts them. They were prohibited from remaining invested with any manager who became the subject of a credible regulatory complaint regarding market manipulation. Cross had spent the last 3 weeks manufacturing false regulatory pressure against me. Whispered inquiries, convenient leaks, coordinated column writing, the whole grind. Every technique he'd used against me was, if documented and framed correctly, itself a form of the exact market manipulation his anchor investor was forbidden to tolerate. He'd handed me the weapon. He'd spent 3 weeks building it, aiming it at me, and never once considered that the same barrel pointed both ways. "Celeste," I said when Walker laid it all out, "how clean can we make the complaint?" Celeste, who lived for exactly this, smiled her deposition smile. "We don't file it," she said. "That's the beautiful part. We don't have to. We just make sure the pension consortium's compliance officer receives a very thorough, very anonymous, very well-sourced briefing on precisely how their star manager has been behaving. Conservative money doesn't wait for a verdict. Conservative money runs at the rumor. We don't beat Cross. We just let his own investors read what he's been doing and draw the conclusion themselves. Do it, I said, quietly. No fingerprints. And Celeste? She paused at the door. Nothing false. Everything in that briefing has to be true. I don't win the way they do. I just make sure the people whose money he's playing with can finally see him as clearly as I can. That was the whole difference between me and every man who'd ever underestimated me. I never had to lie. The truth had always been enough. The only trick, the only thing I'd ever really mastered, was controlling the exact moment the truth arrived, and the exact set of eyes it arrived in front of. 11 days later, Victor Cross's anchor investor pulled out of his fund. It happened quietly, the way the biggest things always do. No headline, no drama, just a curt letter and a redemption notice, and, underneath it, the sound of 100,000 pensions walking out the door. And when the anchor goes, the rest follow, because money is a herd animal and it stampedes at shadows. Within a week, Cross went from a career raider on the hunt to a manager fighting for his own survival, calling his remaining investors, defending his own record, suddenly and completely unable to spare a single soldier for the war on 40 fronts, because every front he had was now his own. He requested another meeting. I did not take it. Instead, I sent David with a single sheet of paper and a message. The paper was an offer to buy the distressed positions Cross now needed to sell at exactly the price a drowning man deserves. The message, which David delivered word for word in that calm, honest voice of his, was this. Ms. Vance wanted me to tell you that you were right about one thing. She'd never run a company under siege before. She wanted to thank you for the practice. I thought that was the end of it. Cross broken, Lawrence's counterpunch collapsed, the company stabilizing, the employees safe. I thought I could finally exhale. Then Walker brought me the letter. It came out of the deepest layer of my grandfather's estate, a sealed envelope that had been sitting for years inside a trust document I'd never had reason to fully unwind because I'd inherited so much that even I hadn't mapped all of it. The instruction attached to it, in my grandfather's careful hand, was a single line. To be opened by Eleanor on the day she no longer needs the Thorne name. Walker had found it while pulling old records to defend against Cross. He didn't ask me what it was. He just set it on my desk and left me alone with it. I opened it that night, on the 40th floor, with the city glittering below and the K glowing above me, and I read my grandfather's last words to me, written before he died, before I ever met Lawrence, before any of this. Eleanor, it began. If you are reading this, then you have already taken back what was ours, and you did it without me ever having to tell you it was ours to take. That means I raised you right. Let me tell you the story I could never tell you while I lived, because I did not want it to become your inheritance until you had already proven you did not need it. The Vance fortune was not always hidden. 60 years ago, it was one of the great open fortunes of this country, built by my father alongside a partner he trusted with his life. That partner's name was Frederick Thorne. I stopped reading. I had to. Frederick Thorne, Lawrence's grandfather, the man whose name hung in gilt letters over the tower I was sitting in. I made myself keep reading. They built it together, my grandfather wrote. The shipping, the logistics, the beginning of everything the Kingsleys still live on today. And when my father lay dying, he left the partnership in Frederick's hands, on a handshake, trusting him to protect our family's half until I came of age. Frederick did not protect it. He buried the paperwork. He rewrote the histories. He told the world the fortune had always been Thorne money, and by the time I was old enough to fight him, he had spent a decade making the truth impossible to prove. What could not be proven in court, I could not reclaim. So I did the only thing left to a man robbed by a friend. I took what remained of our family, and I disappeared it. I buried the Vance name on purpose. I split the fortune into 1,000 invisible pieces, and I taught my children, and I taught you, to keep power behind other people's faces. Because the one lesson Frederick Thorne carved into our family was that a fortune everyone can see is a fortune a friend can steal. I have not told you this because I did not want you to grow up hungry for revenge. Hatred makes for small lives. I wanted you to grow up free. But I am an old man, and I will admit here, in a letter you will not read until I am gone, that I have always hoped. I have hoped that someday, without my ever pointing you at them, without malice, simply by being cleverer and kinder and more patient than they ever were, you would end up holding the thing Frederick Thorne stole from us. Not because you hunted it, because you earned your way to it, and it fell into your hands the way stolen things eventually fall to the people they were taken from. If you are reading this, then it happened. And I want you to understand what it means. The money you used to take back the Thorne empire was Vance money to begin with. You did not conquer a stranger's fortune. You brought our own inheritance home. You have been buying back what was stolen from your great-grandfather, one quiet dollar at a time, and you never even knew it. I set the letter down. I sat for a long time in the dark, and I thought about a balcony 3 years ago, and a glass of champagne, and a golden boy who told me I seemed like the only real person at a party full of vultures. I had spent 3 years believing that meeting was chance, that I had, against all my careful instincts, simply fallen for the wrong man by accident. But I understood, now, sitting in that tower with my grandfather's letter in my hand, that there is no such thing as accident when a whole family's history is a gravity you were raised inside of. I had not been pointed at the Kingsleys. My grandfather had been telling the truth about that. But I had been raised every day of my invisible childhood to be exactly the kind of woman who would drift toward wounded power and quietly master it. And it was no accident at all that the wounded power I drifted toward carried the name of the man who had wounded my family. Some debts run so deep they become instincts. I had married the great-grandson of my family's betrayer, and I had loved him honestly, and I had saved his empire with my family's own stolen money, and then, when he threw me away, I had taken it all back without ever knowing there was anything to take back. My grandfather had hoped I would end up here, and I had, exactly, without a single push. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point I noticed that I wasn't angry. I'd expected anger, the way you brace for a wave. Instead, I felt something quieter and much larger, the feeling of a story I'd been living inside my whole life finally showing me its shape. 3 generations of my family had been robbed and buried and made invisible by the Thorne name. And it had ended with me, in this chair, in this tower, holding all of it, having taken it back not with a war, but with patience, not with hatred, but with a love that turned out to be its own kind of justice. The last line of the letter was the one I would keep. You will be tempted at the end to make them suffer, my grandfather wrote. Don't. Suffering is what small men do to feel large. You are not small, and you never were, even when they made you pour the wine. Take back what is ours, protect the people who depend on it, and then live so well, so freely, so completely beyond their reach, that your happiness becomes the only revenge that ever actually lasts. That is the Vance inheritance, not the money, the freedom. Go and be free, my girl. You have more than earned it. I folded the letter and put it in the pocket of the plain coat. And I made a decision about how this story was going to end. I decided to tell Arthur Thorne the truth, not as a weapon, as an ending. I found him at the country club his family had belonged to for 4 generations, the one that had, in the weeks since the board meeting, begun very quietly not renewing his membership. He was at the bar in the middle of the afternoon, alone, a diminished man in an expensive blazer, and when he saw me walk in, he laughed, a short, ugly sound. Come to gloat, he said. The wine pourer wants to see the old man drink. No, I said. I sat down beside him, uninvited, the way he'd taught me a woman like me should never do. I came to tell you a story about your grandfather. And I told him. All of it. Frederick and my great-grandfather, the partnership, the handshake, the betrayal, the buried paperwork, the stolen half of a fortune that became the entire Thorne empire. I told him that the money I'd used to save his company 3 years ago had been Vance money to begin with, money his own grandfather had stolen from mine, money that had spent 60 years hidden and had finally, quietly, come home. I watched it land on him piece by piece, this proud, cruel, broken old man learning that the great name he'd spent his life failing to live up to had been built on a theft, that even his family's original sin wasn't his own, that he was standing at the bottom of a debt 3 generations deep that he'd never even known he owed. When I finished, Arthur was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that surprised me. He never told me, he said. My grandfather, my father, any of them. He turned his glass slowly on the bar. I spent my whole life thinking Frederick built it all himself. That's why I could never match him. I was measuring myself against a giant who turned out to be a thief." He laughed again, softer. "You know the worst part? If your family had stayed, if the two of you had built it together the way it was supposed to be, my grandchildren and your grandchildren would have inherited the same thing. We'd have been one family. Instead, he stole it and buried you, and 60 years later, here we are, and it all comes back to you anyway, and I'm an old man alone at a bar." He looked at me. "You didn't have to tell me this." "No," I agreed. "Then why?" I thought about my grandfather's letter. "Suffering is what small men do to feel large." "Because you spent 3 years looking at me and seeing nothing," I said. "And I wanted you to understand, before the end, that the nothing at your dinner table was the whole history of your family come to collect. Not to make you suffer, Arthur, to make you see. That's the only thing I ever actually wanted from any of you. Not the company, not revenge, just to be seen clearly, once, by the people who decided I wasn't worth looking at." I stood. "You saw me clearly for about 4 seconds just now. That's more than your son has ever managed. Keep the membership, by the way. I called the club this morning. Consider it the only Vance charity a Thorne will ever get." I left him at the bar. I don't know what he did after that. I heard months later that he sold the last of his personal holdings, moved somewhere quiet on the coast, and stopped drinking, which I chose to believe was him trying, in the small time he had left, to be a slightly better version of the man he'd been. Maybe that's generous. But my grandfather told me to live free, and you cannot live free while you're still holding people in your fist, even the ones who earned it. Lawrence was a different story. Lawrence did not get to see clearly because Lawrence never had, and the end of his story was the end he'd built for himself, brick by careless brick. He'd bet everything on Cross. When Cross collapsed, Lawrence had nothing left. No company, no ally, no name that opened doors. Only debts he'd run up, assuming the counterpunch would land and the empire would come back to him. The creditors he'd charmed for years stopped taking his calls the moment it was clear he'd never inherit anything again. Camille was long gone. She'd vanished the week after the board meeting, exactly as she'd always planned, just as I'd promised her, with none of the money. The friends who'd nodded along at every cruel joke he'd ever made at my expense discovered urgent reasons to be unreachable. Lawrence Thorne, who had been born at the finish line, who had spent his whole life believing the universe loved the Thorne name, ended up exactly where he'd always been terrified of ending up. Ordinary. Not ruined in some dramatic, cinematic way, just ordinary. A man with a famous last name and nothing behind it, discovering at 34 that he'd never actually built a single thing, that everything he'd ever had was either inherited or, it turned out, stolen, or quietly provided by a wife he'd kept in the guest bedroom. He came to see me one last time. Not at my office. He didn't have the standing to get past the lobby anymore. He caught me outside a restaurant one evening, and Walker moved to intercept, and I waved him off because I could see immediately that this Lawrence wasn't dangerous. This Lawrence was just lost. "I keep trying to figure out where it went wrong," he said. "No charm left, no fury, just a man in a wrinkled coat on a sidewalk. I keep going back over it, and I can't find the moment I lost you. It's like I look for it and it's just not there." And that, right there, was the whole tragedy of Lawrence Thorne, said in his own words. "That's because there was no moment, Lawrence," I said, not unkindly. "You didn't lose me in a moment. You lost me in 1,000 small, ordinary days you don't even remember, because none of them cost you anything at the time. The guest bedroom, the headaches, the wine you told me to pour, the dinners where you let your mother call me nothing and said nothing back. You were never looking for the moment you lost me, because you never noticed you had me. You can't find the moment it went wrong because you weren't there for any of it. You never were." I looked at him, this man I'd loved on a balcony, and I felt the last of it finally let go, clean, like a splinter working its way out. "Goodbye, Lawrence. I hope you learn to see people. It's too late for us, but it's not too late for you to stop being the kind of man who has to lose everything before he looks up." I walked into the restaurant. I didn't look back. I'd looked back at that man enough for one lifetime. The months after that were the strangest of my life, because for the first time I had nothing to hide. I'd spent my entire adulthood behind a wall of invisibility, running my fund in secret, wearing my real wealth like a knife under a plain coat. And now, the wall was gone. The whole city knew who I was. There was no more Ashford Silvercrest to keep in the shadows, no more guest bedroom to run a 9-figure fund out of, no more husband to keep from seeing the numbers on my screen. I woke up every morning as exactly who I was, and it took me longer than I want to admit to stop bracing for the moment someone would take it away. I threw myself into the company because the company was real, and I found that I loved it, not the taking, the running. Cross had been wrong about that, and it was the only thing he'd gotten wrong. He'd told me running a conglomerate was a hungry, ungrateful animal that would eat 10 years of my life. But he'd never run anything he actually cared about, so he didn't know that when you love the thing, the grind isn't a cost. It's the point. I loved the logistics puzzles at 2 in the morning. I loved walking the shipping floor and learning the names of the dock workers Camille had nearly stolen the pensions out from under. I loved promoting a 30-year-old warehouse manager named Maya who'd been ignored for a decade and who turned out to have the single sharpest operational mind in the entire company. I loved building something in the light after a lifetime of building in the dark. And I loved the late nights with David, though I was very slow to admit what they were. It happened the way real things happen, which is to say slowly and without either of us announcing it. We worked. We argued about the business. He kept telling me the truth, even when it wasn't what I wanted to hear. And I kept discovering, night after night, that a man telling me the truth was the single most attractive thing I had ever encountered, precisely because I'd gone so long without it. One night around the 8th month, we finished late, and he walked me down to the lobby, and under the gilded K, the same K I'd stood under the morning I called David and told him to get me the board list, he stopped and said, "Can I ask you something and you don't have to answer?" "You can ask me anything," I said, which was true, and which I'd never once been able to say to Lawrence. "When this is all settled," David said, "the company, the name, all of it, when you finally get to just live your life." He looked at me, steady, honest, a little scared, which I loved. "Is there room in that life for someone who's only ever seen you clearly? Because I have, Nora. From the first quarterly report you were secretly writing 3 years ago that I couldn't figure out who'd authored. I saw you before I knew your name, and I'd like to keep seeing you if you'd let me. No armor, no guest bedroom, just you, exactly as much as you want to be seen. I want to tell you I said something wise. I didn't. I stood under the K where my whole life had turned, and I felt 3 years of ice I hadn't even known was still there finally start to melt, and I said, I don't know how to do this, the being seen. I've been hiding my whole life. I know, he said. I'm not in a hurry. I've been paying attention for 3 years. I can pay attention for 3 more. And he smiled, and he didn't push, and he walked me to my car and said goodnight and went home. And I sat in the dark of my car for a long time feeling something I hadn't felt since a balcony, except this time, it wasn't a golden boy's charm. It was just a decent man, telling me the truth, and being willing to wait while I learned to believe it. I didn't rush it. My grandfather had told me to live free, and part of living free was refusing to fall into the next thing just because I was tired of standing alone. So David and I went slowly. Dinners, a concert, a ridiculous afternoon at an aquarium where he watched the fish and I watched him, this steady, honest man, and understood that I had spent 3 years married to a performance, and I was only now meeting what a partnership actually felt like. It felt like nothing, in the best way. It felt like putting down a weight so old I'd stopped noticing I was carrying it. But there was one thing left to do before I could really live free, and it was the thing my grandfather had, in his way, been asking me to do all along. I was going to bring the Vance name back. For 60 years, my family had lived in deliberate invisibility, buried on purpose after Frederick Thorne stole our half of the fortune. My grandfather had made that choice out of a wound, and it had kept us safe, and it had made me the woman I was, patient and hidden and impossible to steal from. But the wound was closed now. I'd brought the stolen fortune home, and I decided that the last act of taking back what was ours was to stop hiding that we existed. I was going to rename the company, not Thorne, not Ashford Silvercrest, my shadow name. I was going to hang my great-grandfather's name over that tower, the name Frederick Thorne had spent a decade erasing, the name that should have been up there beside his all along, Vance. And I was going to do it in front of the entire city, at the industry's biggest gala of the year, the same kind of gala where a golden boy had once handed a plain girl a glass of champagne, and where a cruel woman had once told that same girl her real pearls looked cheap. I was going to walk into that room as myself, completely, for the first time in my life. And I was going to tell 3 generations worth of truth to every powerful person who'd ever looked straight through me. Celeste thought it was theatrical. "You could just file the name change," she said. "It's a form. It takes a day." "I know," I said, "but a truth you file quietly is just a transaction. I learned that a long time ago." I smiled. "Some truths you owe it to your family to say out loud, in the biggest room you can find, with all the right people watching. My grandfather hid us for 60 years to keep us safe. I'm going to unhide us in one night so that no Vance ever has to pour anyone's wine again." 2 weeks before the gala, Leo knocked on my door with the particular pale look he got when the numbers had told him something ugly. "Someone's shorting us," he said, quietly, "building a position against Thorne Group stock for about a month now, betting hard that the price is going to crater. And in the last week, there's been a drip of stories. Nothing you can sue over, just tone. Questions about Vance's temperament. Is the revenge queen in over her head? Sources inside the company describe chaos. Coordinated. Someone's trying to talk the stock down so their short pays off. Sources inside the company," I repeated. "That's the part I don't like," Leo said. "The details in these stories are real, small, but real. Board meeting details. Things only someone in the room would know." I already knew, the way you know the ending of a story you've read 100 times. There are only so many people in the room, and only one kind of person who bets against the very company that pays his director's fee. Walker confirmed it in 3 days. Albright. The gray director who'd moved to accept my takeover the moment the wind shifted. The one who'd read the survival math faster than anyone at the table. He'd never been loyal to me. He'd been loyal to whoever was winning. And now he'd made a calculation of his own. That a fresh, dramatic, revenge-driven chairwoman was a fragile thing, and that if he could seed enough doubt in the press while shorting the stock, he could profit on the way down and then lead a boardroom push to remove me for stability, installing himself as interim chairman. It was, in its small, gray way, the same play Cross had run, just cheaper, from the inside, by a man too timid to raid openly and too greedy to stay honest. The old me, the invisible me, would have handled it in the dark, documented it, taken it to him privately, forced a quiet resignation, kept it all off the front page. That was the Vance way. 60 years of doing everything behind other people's faces. But I was done being invisible. That was the whole point of the gala. So I did something my grandfather might not have approved of. Or maybe he would have, because there was a line in his letter I kept coming back to. Control the exact moment the truth arrives, and the exact set of eyes it arrives in front of. I let Albright keep going. For 2 weeks. I let him build his short bigger, let him feed his tame reporters, let him whisper to the other directors about stability and the optics of a revenge narrative. I let him walk further and further out onto the branch, and I made sure, through channels he'd never trace, that he believed it was working, that the stock was softening, that the board was nervous, that his moment was coming. I even let him RSVP to the gala, where he assumed he'd be circling me like a shark, waiting for the night to go badly so he could position himself as the calm hand the company needed. He didn't know I'd invited him to his own unmaking. Meanwhile, a different visitor came to see me, and this one I hadn't expected at all. Camille Sterling walked back into my life 11 days before the gala, and she looked nothing like the woman who'd filed her nails in a conference room. The expensive armor was gone. She looked tired and human, and when she sat down across from me, she didn't perform anything, which was its own kind of shock. "I'm not here for money," she said before I could ask. "I know better than to try to squeeze you. I'm here because I've been running for 8 months and I'm tired, and I've had a lot of time to think about the fact that you're the only person in this whole story who beat me clean." She laughed without much in it. "You could have handed me to the authorities. You had the file. You still have the file. Instead, you made me sit in a front row and watch you win, and then you let me disappear. I've spent 8 months trying to figure out why." "Because ruining you wasn't worth anything to me," I said. "You were a symptom, Camille, not the disease." "I know that now." She looked at her hands. "I came to give you something. Consider it the last honest thing I do before I vanish for good." She slid a small drive across the desk. When I was inside Thorne running Meridian, I wasn't the only one skimming. I was just the biggest. There's a director who's been running a smaller grift for years. Nothing as clean as mine. He's sloppy. I kept the records because in my business, you always keep records on the other thieves. His name's Albright. And if the tabloid stories are anything to go by, he's about to try something with the stock, isn't he? I can smell it. It's exactly what I'd do if I were a coward with a board seat. I looked at the drive. Then I looked at this woman who had, in her own crooked way, just handed me the last nail for a coffin I was already building. "Why?" I said. "Why give me this?" Camille was quiet for a moment. "Because you're the only person who ever saw exactly what I was and didn't flinch and didn't try to use it to own me," she said. "You just let me go. Nobody's ever done that. Not once in my whole life. I don't have a way to say thank you that isn't a transaction, because transactions are the only language I speak. So here." She stood. "It's the most valuable thing I own, which, if you think about it, is a pretty grim summary of my entire life." She almost smiled. "Nail him, Nora. Do it in public. He's exactly the kind of man who taught both of us that the world only respects people it's afraid of. Make him afraid." She walked to the door, and I said, "Camille." She stopped. "When you disappear this time," I said, "disappear into something real. You're too good at reading people to spend the rest of your life stealing from them. There are honest jobs that need exactly what you have. If you ever want one, under a name that isn't running from anything, call this number." I wrote it down. Not my office. A small fund I seeded for exactly this kind of person. The sharp and the burned and the almost lost. The Vance family knows something about disappearing and coming back. It's the only thing we've ever really been good at. She took the number. She didn't say anything, but she folded it carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep. And then she was gone, and I never saw her again. Though 2 years later, a reformed corporate investigator with a new name and a frighteningly good record would send me a single line on the anniversary of that day. It just said, "Real this time. Thank you." And I would know exactly who it was. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Ardennes Hotel, the same room, though almost no one remembered it, where a golden boy had once handed a plain girl a glass of champagne on a balcony 3 floors up. I remembered. I'd chosen the venue on purpose. I arrived last, again, because some lessons are worth repeating. But this time, I did not wear the plain coat. I had worn that coat to be underestimated, and I had been underestimated enough for one lifetime. This time, I walked into that ballroom in the one thing I'd never let anyone see me in, the truth. A gown the deep silver gray of the fund I'd hidden for a decade. My grandmother's pearls, the real ones, the ones Beatrice Thorne had called cheap, worth more than every jewel in that room combined. And no armor at all, because I'd finally learned that being seen completely is its own kind of armor, the only kind that can't be taken from you. The room noticed. Of course it did. 8 months earlier, this same crowd had learned that the invisible woman serving champagne in the background of their parties was the richest, sharpest operator in the city. And now, here she was, walking in as herself for the first time, and you could feel the whole room recalibrate. The people who'd looked through me for years suddenly could not stop looking. That's the thing about invisibility. The moment you set it down, everyone who ignored you has to live with the fact that they did. Beatrice Thorne was there. Diminished, but there. Because women like Beatrice would attend their own funerals if the guest list was good enough. When she saw me, she did something that told me the 4 seconds of clear sight I'd given her at my office had stuck. She inclined her head. A small, stiff bow, from a proud woman to the girl she'd called nothing. It cost her everything, and we both knew it, and I gave her the only mercy that mattered. I nodded back once, as an equal, and let her keep the shred of dignity that gesture bought her. My grandfather was right. Suffering is what small people do to feel large. I had no more use for making anyone small. Albright was there too, circling exactly as I'd known he would, working the room, murmuring to the other directors, planting his careful seeds of stability and concern. A gray man who thought tonight was the night the fragile revenge queen would finally wobble and hand him his opening. He'd built his short to its maximum. He'd primed his reporters for a bad news night. He was, in his mind, moments from the culmination of a clever, patient plan. He had no idea he was standing in a trap I'd let him build himself, brick by brick, for 2 weeks. And David was there, at my table, steady and honest in a way that made every performing man in that room look like exactly what they were. He didn't hover, he didn't posture. He just caught my eye when I walked in, and he gave me the smallest nod, the same nod he'd given me across the board table 8 months ago, the nod that said, "I'm already on your side. You can put the armor down." Except tonight, there was no armor to put down, and that was the whole point. The evening had a program, speeches, awards, the industry congratulating itself the way industries do. I'd arranged quietly through a decade of favors and one very large donation to have the final word. The organizers thought they were giving the season's most talked-about figure a chance to make a graceful statement. They didn't know I was going to use it to bury a traitor and resurrect a name 60 years in the grave. When they called me up, the room went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when it senses that something real is about to happen instead of the usual noise. I walked to the podium. I looked out at all of them, the powerful and the gray and the cruel and the merely curious, the whole city that had spent my entire life deciding I wasn't worth seeing, and I set down a single sheet of paper I didn't need, because I'd known what I was going to say since I was a girl in a plain dress on a balcony. "Most of you know me now as Eleanor Vance," I began. "8 months ago, you learned that I'd been running a fund called Ashford Silvercrest in secret for a decade, and that I'd quietly held the debt of the Thorne Group the entire time I was married to its heir. The papers called it revenge. They called me the wife who owned the empire, the Ice Queen. It made good copy. I let a small smile show. But I didn't come up here to talk about revenge. I came up here to tell you a true story that's older than any of us, and to correct a lie that's been hanging over this city for 60 years. I could feel Albright across the room, still smiling his gray smile, not yet understanding that the night was not going to go the way he'd paid for it to go. "But before I tell you the old story," I said, "I need to deal with a small, present-day piece of business. Because there's a man in this room who spent the last month betting against the very company he's paid to protect, feeding lies to reporters to talk the stock down, planning to profit on the way, and then remove me for, and I love this phrase, stability." I looked directly at him. "Good evening, Mr. Albright. I'm so glad you came." Albright's smile froze. Around him, heads turned. A gray man learns very fast what it feels like to have a spotlight find him in a room he thought he told the shadows of. "That's a serious accusation," he said, standing, "going for the wounded dignity play, the only play a cornered gray man has. And a strange thing to say at a gala. If you have a concern about my conduct as a director, there are proper channels." "There are," I agreed. "I chose this one." I nodded, and at the back of the room, Celeste Lim stepped forward and began, quietly and efficiently, handing a single-page summary to every table. "What you're all receiving is a documented record of Mr. Albright's short position against Thorne Group stock opened 5 weeks ago, alongside a timeline of the anonymous sources inside the company stories that appeared in exactly the pattern you'd expect from a man trying to drive down a price he's betting against. It's all verifiable. Trading records don't lie, even when directors do." I paused. "And that would be damning enough. But Mr. Albright made one mistake that turns this from a scandal into an ending. He's not new to quietly taking money out of this company. He's been doing it for years, in smaller, sloppier ways than the last thief who tried, and unlike her, he was careless enough to leave records that ended up in my hands." I looked at him, almost gently. "You should have just collected your director's fee and stayed honest, Mr. Albright. Honesty was the one position in this whole company nobody was competing for. You could have owned it for free." Albright's face had gone the exact color Lawrence's had gone 8 months ago, the color of old paper, the color men turn when they finally understand that the quiet woman was counting the whole time. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because there was nothing to say. Every defense was a confession. The same trap Camille had sat in, the same trap all of them eventually sat in, because you cannot argue your way out of a truth that's already been handed to every person in the room. "The board will formally remove you Monday," I said. "Tonight you're just a guest who's overstayed. There's a car outside, I'd take it." And Albright, gray and ruined and finally completely seen, walked out of that ballroom through a silence so total you could hear his own footsteps mock him. And no one, not one person in that room full of people who'd smiled at him for decades, stood up to walk with him. That's the thing the Holloways of the world never learn until the very end. The room only ever respected what it was afraid of, and the moment you stop being frightening, you discover you were never actually liked. I let the door close behind him. Then I set the present-day business aside and I told them the old story. 60 years ago, I said, there were two men who built a company together. Partners, friends. One of them was named Frederick Thorne, and his name is on the tower half of you have offices in. The other man was my great-grandfather, and his name is on nothing in this whole city, because when he lay dying and left his family's half of that fortune in his partner's hands on a handshake, Frederick Thorne buried the paperwork, rewrote the histories, and told the world he'd built it all alone. I looked out at them, steady. Everything the Thorne name has ever meant to this city was, at its foundation, half stolen. Stolen from a family that then spent 60 years hidden on purpose, made invisible by choice, because the lesson my great-grandfather's betrayal taught us was that a fortune everyone can see is a fortune a friend can take. My grandfather buried our name to keep us safe. He raised his children and me to keep our power behind other people's faces. He made us ghosts, because ghosts can't be robbed. The room was utterly silent. Beatrice Thorne had gone very still at her table, learning, along with the whole city, the true shape of the name she'd married into and spent so proudly. I did not know any of this when I married Lawrence Thorne, I said. I want that on the record. I did not marry him for revenge, or for the company, or to settle a 60-year-old score I didn't even know existed. I married him because he handed me a glass of champagne on a balcony in this very hotel, and for one evening made a hidden girl feel seen. I saved his family's company, quietly for 3 years, with my own fortune, because I loved him and didn't want him to lose it. And only after it was all over, only after he threw me away and I took it all back, did I learn the truth my grandfather left me in a letter. That the money I'd used to save the Thorne empire had been Vance money to begin with. That without ever intending to, without hunting for it, I had spent 3 years buying back my own family's stolen inheritance, one quiet dollar at a time. I heard someone in the room draw a sharp breath. It's a good story. It's a true one. Those are the only ones worth telling in a room like that. So here is what I came here tonight to say. I straightened. The company you have known as the Thorne Group is being renamed. Not to Ashford, my shadow. Not to anything hidden. As of Monday, the name over that tower will be the name that should have been up there 60 years ago, beside Frederick Thorne's, before he decided a friend's family was easier to erase than to honor. I let it land. Vance, my great-grandfather's name, unburied, in the light. For the first time in 3 generations, a Vance is going to stand in the open and say, "We were always here. You just weren't looking. And we are done being invisible." I don't know who started the applause. I've never known. But it began somewhere in the back, a single pair of hands. And then it moved through that ballroom like a tide coming in. And within seconds, the entire room was on its feet. The powerful and the gray and the cruel and the curious, all of them standing for a name most of them had never heard until that moment. A name that had been stolen and buried and erased and had, against every odd, come home. And at my table, David Romero was on his feet with the rest, not clapping the loudest, not performing anything, just looking at me with a steady, quiet pride that said the only thing I'd ever wanted anyone to say to me. I see you. I always did. I stood at that podium, in my grandmother's real pearls, in the room where a hidden girl had once been handed a glass of champagne, and I let myself be seen, completely, for the first time in my life. And it did not feel like revenge. My grandfather had been right about that too. Revenge is small, and this was not small. This was a family, 3 generations of ghosts, finally allowed to exist. I thought the gala was the ending. It was only the beginning of the last and largest fight of my life. Because when you unbury a name that's been dead for 60 years, you don't just correct a lie. You set a precedent. And precedents frighten the powerful more than any single loss ever could. Because a loss is a wound, and a precedent is a disease. 3 days after the gala, Walker came into my office without knocking, which he had never once done, and set down a single photograph. It was old, black and white. 2 men shaking hands on the steps of a building I recognized. One of them was Frederick Thorne. The other was a tall, cold-eyed man I didn't know. "That's the man who bought the rest," Walker said. "The rest of what?" "The company was only half of what Frederick stole," Walker said. "You reclaimed the company because you happened to marry into it. But your great-grandfather's fortune wasn't just the shipping partnership. There were land holdings, a bank, mineral rights that turned into half the energy grid this city runs on. Frederick couldn't hold all of it himself without drawing questions, so within a few years of the theft, he sold the biggest pieces, quietly, to the one family powerful enough to bury them even deeper than he had." Walker tapped the photograph. This man, Edward Steele. He knew exactly what he was buying. Stolen Vance assets, laundered through a Thorne signature. His family has been sitting on the foundation of your family's real fortune for 60 years. And they are not a family that lets go of foundations. The Sinclairs. Everyone in the city knew the Sinclairs the way everyone knows the mountains, as a fact of the landscape rather than a family you could actually meet. Old Lawrence Steele, Cornelius's grandson, was the closest thing this country had to a king. His holdings made mine look like a hobby. His reach made Cross look like a street hustler. And if the pieces of my family's fortune he'd been quietly holding for 60 years turned out to be stolen goods, then the entire foundation of the Steele dynasty had a crack in it that ran all the way to the bedrock. "When I renamed the company Vance," I said slowly, "I didn't just embarrass the Kingsleys. I put a legal theory into the open, that Vance assets were stolen and can be reclaimed. And every asset Frederick ever touched is now a question," Walker said, "including the ones Lawrence Steele is sitting on. You didn't fire a shot at the Kingsleys. You fired one, without meaning to, at the biggest family in the country. And a man like Lawrence Steele doesn't wait to see if the bullet lands. He removes the person who fired it. The first move came within the week, and it was so much more sophisticated than anything Cross or Albright had managed that I felt a strange, cold thrill of respect. There were no crude short positions, no tabloid whispers. Instead, a distinguished law firm I'd never heard from filed a quiet motion questioning the provenance of the Vance name change itself, arguing that my historical claims were unsubstantiated and defamatory to several established families. Simultaneously, two of my key lenders received not threats, but opportunities. Extraordinarily generous offers to refinance my debt on terms so good they'd be fools to refuse. Terms that would quietly transfer the leverage over my company from me to an anonymous vehicle I knew, without being able to prove it, traced back to Steele. And a regulator I'd never had trouble with suddenly announced a routine review of the Thorne to Vance transition. The kind of review that isn't an accusation, but hangs over a company like weather. It was elegant. It was patient. It was, I realized, exactly how I would have done it. Lawrence Steele wasn't trying to defeat me in a battle. He was trying to make the Vance name unsustainable, to make reclaiming a stolen fortune so slow and costly and legally radioactive that I'd retreat back into the safe invisibility my grandfather had chosen 60 years ago. He wasn't trying to beat me. He was trying to make me bury us again. And that, more than any threat he could have made, was the thing I would not survive doing. I called my people into the office that night. Celeste, Walker, Leo, and David, the four people I trusted with everything, the found family I'd built in the light after a lifetime of hiding. "I need you to understand what we're facing," I said. "Everyone we've beaten so far, Lawrence, Cross, Albright, they underestimated me. That was the whole game. They kept confusing invisible with absent, and it kept costing them. But Lawrence Steele doesn't underestimate anyone. He's read the same book I have. He knows exactly what it means to keep power behind other people's faces, because his family has done it for 100 years. For the first time in my life, I'm not the smartest hidden player in the game." I looked around at them. I'm facing someone exactly like me, just older, richer, and 60 years better funded. There was a silence. Then David said the thing that I would remember longest out of everything anyone said to me in that whole long war. "No," he said, "you're not facing someone exactly like you. That's what he thinks. That's his mistake." He leaned forward. "Lawrence Steele spent 100 years hiding power to protect a lie. You spent your whole life hiding power, and the second you didn't have to anymore, you stood up in a ballroom and told the truth to everyone who'd ever looked through you. He hides because he's guarding stolen goods. You hid because you were the one who got robbed. That's not the same person, Nora. That's opposites. And it's the one thing he will never see coming, because a man who's spent his life in the dark can't imagine that anyone would ever choose the light on purpose. Lawrence Steele agreed to meet me. That surprised everyone but me. Men at his altitude don't take meetings with their targets. They have people for that, layers of people. And the whole point of being a Steele is never having to be in the room. But I'd sent the request through a channel he couldn't ignore, and I'd attached to it a single item, a scan of one page, the oldest page in the file Walker had built. It was a ledger entry from 60 years ago, in Edward Steele's own handwriting, recording the purchase of a block of assets from Frederick Thorne at a fraction of their value, with a notation in the margin that a careful man never should have written, and an arrogant one couldn't resist. Origin: Vance. Unrecoverable. Unrecoverable. Edward Steele had written it himself. He'd known exactly what he was buying, known it was stolen, known whose family he was helping to erase, and he'd been so certain the Vales would never rise to claim it that he'd made a joke of it in his own ledger. I sent Lawrence that single page, and Lawrence Steele, king of the city, agreed to see me the next day. He received me in a study that felt less like a room than a held breath, all dark wood and older silence, in a house on a hill that had watched the whole city grow up beneath it. He was 90, thin as paper, with eyes that had not gotten less sharp for being old. He did not stand. He gestured to a chair, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other, two people who had spent their entire lives keeping power behind other faces, finally sitting face to face with nothing hidden between us. "You have your great-grandfather's chin," he said at last. "I met him once, before. He had a way of looking at a room like he was counting it. A dry ghost of a smile. You do it too. I noticed the moment you walked in." "You knew him," I said. "I knew of the theft," Lawrence said without flinching, "because at 90, with a page like that in your target's hand, there is no point in flinching. I was a young man. My grandfather told me the family's foundation had a flaw in it, and he told me the name of the flaw, and he told me it would never matter because the Vales were buried, and burial is forever." He folded his paper-thin hands. "For 60 years, he was right. You are the first thing in my very long life that has proven my grandfather wrong. I confess I did not think it was possible. I have spent a great deal of effort this month trying to put you back in the ground." He tilted his head. "It isn't working, is it? That's why you're here. You've come to tell me it isn't working." "I've come to offer you a way to survive it," I said. That got a real reaction, a flicker, the first genuine surprise I'd seen on that ancient face. "Survive it?" he repeated. "You think you're in a position to let me survive anything? Child, I could tie your Vance name up in courts until your grandchildren are old. I could make reclaiming a single acre of what my grandfather bought cost you more than the acre is worth. I have more lawyers than you have employees. I have judges at my dinner table. You have a ledger page and a good story." "You do have all of that," I agreed. "And if this were a fight about money, or lawyers, or courts, you would win, and we both know it. I can't outspend you. I can't outlitigate you. You're right." I leaned forward. "But you've made the same mistake every man in my life has made, Mr. Steele, and I'm surprised, because you're the first one smart enough that I thought you might not. You think this is a fight about ownership. It isn't. It's a fight about the one thing your family has and mine never did. Legitimacy." He went very still. "Your grandfather didn't just want the Vance assets," I said. "He wanted them clean. He wanted them buried so deep that the Steele name could sit on top of them for 100 years and be called old money instead of stolen money. The whole value of what you're protecting isn't the assets. It's the story. That the Sinclairs are the bedrock this city was built on. That your fortune is the honest, ancient, unquestionable foundation everyone else's success rests against." I let it sit. "I don't have to take a single acre back to destroy that, Mr. Steele. All I have to do is what I already did at the gala. Tell the truth, in public, with proof, and let it spread. I don't need to win in court. I just need the whole city to spend the next 20 years wondering which parts of the Steele Foundation were stolen from a family you helped bury. I can't take your fortune, but I can take the one thing you actually care about, the only thing money can never buy back once it's gone. I can turn old money into dirty money, permanently, with one true story, and there is not enough law in this country to untell it." The oldest, most powerful man in the city looked at me for a long, long time. And then Lawrence Steele did something I don't think he had done in 50 years. He laughed. A real one, thin and surprised and almost delighted. "My grandfather," he said, "should have made sure your great-grandfather had no daughters." He shook his head slowly. "You are not here to beg. You are not even here to threaten, not really. You are here to sell me my own survival at a price of your choosing, and you have arranged it so that refusing costs me more than paying. That is exactly what I would have done." He studied me with something that was no longer hostility. It was closer to recognition. "All right, Eleanor Vance, name your price. What does it cost me to keep my grandfather's lie from becoming my epitaph?" I had thought about the price for a long time before I ever walked up that hill. The greedy answer was obvious. Take it all. Every acre, every mineral right, the bank, the share of the energy grid, 60 years of compounded value on the whole stolen half of my family's fortune. I could have named a number that would have made me one of the wealthiest people in the country and left the Steele dynasty a hollow shell. Part of me, the part that had poured the wine and slept in the guest bedroom and been called nothing at a dinner table, wanted exactly that. Wanted to do to them what their grandfather had done to mine. But I'd read my grandfather's letter too many times to make his enemies mistake. Suffering is what small men do to feel large. You are not small. Take back what is ours, protect the people who depend on it, and then live so well, so freely, so completely beyond their reach, that your happiness becomes the only revenge that ever actually lasts. "I don't want it all," I told Lawrence Steele. "I could take it all. You know I could. But I've watched what happens to families that build their whole identity around owning things they stole, and I'd rather not become one. So here's my price, and it's smaller than you're braced for, which is going to bother you more than a large one would." I laid it out. First, a full private acknowledgement, signed, notarized, sealed, of exactly what Edward Steele had bought and from whom, held by both our families, never to be made public as long as the terms held. Not a weapon I'd use, a weapon I'd own, so that neither he nor any Steele after him could ever again pretend the veils hadn't existed. The truth, kept, not spent. Second, the return of one specific asset. Not the bank, not the grid, not the land. The original building, the one on the steps of which Cornelius and Frederick had shaken hands in that black and white photograph, the place where the theft was sealed 60 years ago. It had passed through Steele hands and become nothing important to them, a minor holding in a portfolio too large to notice it. But it was where my family's erasure had been signed, and I wanted it back, not for its value, but so that the ending of the story could happen in the same place as the beginning. Some circles you owe it to your ancestors to close. Third, and this was the one that made the old man's eyes narrow, a foundation. Endowed jointly, permanently by both families, in the Vance name, funded by a fraction of the value of the stolen assets, dedicated to exactly one thing. Finding the people that powerful families had made invisible, the erased, the buried, the robbed by a friend, and giving them the one thing my grandfather had given me. Not revenge. The resources to become impossible to erase. A machine, funded by the Sinclairs in perpetuity, for making sure no family could ever be buried the way mine had been. "That's it," I said. "That's the whole price. A truth we keep, a building I take back, and a foundation you fund forever that undoes, quietly for other people, the exact thing your family did to mine. You keep the fortune, you keep the name, you keep the legitimacy, because I never tell the story, because I'll be holding a signed confession that makes telling it unnecessary. You survive, Mr. Steele. Your dynasty survives. All it costs you is admitting the truth in private and spending a rounding error's worth of your fortune, forever, on making sure your family's original sin can never be committed against anyone else again." Lawrence Steele was quiet for a very long time. "You could have ruined me," he said finally. "You had the shot. Most people would have taken it." "Most people have never read the letter my grandfather left me," I said. "Ruining you would have made me feel large for about a week. And then I'd have been exactly what your grandfather was, a person who confused taking things from people with being someone. I'm not going to spend the fortune I fought my whole life to reclaim on becoming the thing that stole it." I stood. "My grandfather buried our name to keep us safe from men like your grandfather. I'm not going to honor that by turning into one. I'm going to honor it by making sure the burying stops. With me, in both directions. The old man looked up at me from his chair, this 90-year-old king who had spent a lifetime certain that everyone who ever sat across from him wanted, in the end, the same thing he wanted, which was more. And for the first time, I think, he was looking at someone who genuinely didn't. You know, he said slowly, in 60 years, no one has ever frightened me the way you just did. Not with the threat, with the mercy. A person who wants everything, I understand. I can fight that person. I've fought them my whole life. But a person who could take everything and chooses not to? He shook his head. That's a kind of power I never learned. My grandfather never taught it to me, because he didn't have it either. He reached for the pen on his desk, the deal already made in the only place that mattered, which was between two people who finally understood each other. Draw up your terms, all three. I'll sign them before you leave this house. And Eleanor? He looked at me, and the hostility was entirely gone now, replaced by something an old man rarely gives a young one. Your great-grandfather was robbed by his best friend and buried by mine. And it took 3 generations and a woman everyone mistook for a wine pourer to bring the name back into the light. Whatever else I've been in my life, let me be the last Steele who was your family's enemy. I'd like the next ones to be something better. So would I said. That's the whole point of the foundation. And I walked out of that house on the hill, having won the largest fight of my life, not by taking everything, but by being at last the one thing none of them had ever been able to imagine. Someone who'd been given every reason to become a monster and simply chose not to. The building came back to me on a gray morning a month later. It was nothing much to look at, an old 6-story stone thing downtown, the kind of building people walk past for their whole lives without seeing, which felt exactly right, given everything. I went alone the first time, and I stood on the steps where 2 men had shaken hands and erased my family 60 years ago. And I put my palm flat against the cold stone, and I said quietly to no one, "We're back." It's a strange thing to talk to a building, but some circles you have to close out loud, or they don't close at all. Then I went inside and I started turning it into the home of the Vance Foundation, the machine Lawrence Steele would fund forever for finding the people the powerful had made invisible. I put Maya, the warehouse manager everyone had ignored for a decade, on its first board, because who better to find overlooked people than someone who'd been one? I put a chair on that board with Camille's new name on it too, the reformed investigator, because she'd asked, in her 1 anniversary line, for something real, and there is nothing more real than helping the next almost lost person find their way back. And I kept 1 office in that building for myself, small, plain, on the top floor, with a single window looking out over the city that had spent my whole life not seeing me, and I hung exactly 1 thing on the wall. My grandfather's letter, framed, the last line facing the chair where I'd sit. Go and be free, my girl. You have more than earned it. I was learning to, slowly. Freedom, it turned out, was a harder skill than power. Power I'd mastered in the dark before I was 20. Freedom I had to learn in the light in my 30s, 1 unguarded day at a time, and the person who taught me most of it was David. We took it slowly, the way I'd promised myself we would. And then one evening it stopped being slow the way those things do, all at once, and also not at all. He brought me dinner to the plain little office in the reclaimed building, terrible takeout like the old late nights, and we ate it on the floor because I hadn't put furniture in yet. And at some point he stopped talking about the company and just looked at me and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as the plain truth, because plain truth is the only currency you've ever actually trusted." "Okay," I said. "I'm not with you for any of it," he said. "Not the fund, not the company, not the name you brought back, not the war you won against a man 3 times my age. If you lost every dollar tomorrow, if you had to go back to pouring wine at other people's parties, I'd carry the tray with you." I fell for the woman writing brilliant quarterly reports out of a guest bedroom that nobody would ever get credit for. I fell for the part of you that was true when there was no audience and no reward, when being that good and that careful bought you nothing but a headache complaint from a man who didn't deserve you. He set down the takeout. You've spent your whole life being loved for what you could give people, or hated for what you wouldn't. I'm just telling you there's at least 1 person who worked out exactly who you are and wants nothing from her except the privilege of paying attention. That's all. You don't have to do anything with it. I looked at this steady, honest man on the floor of a building where my family had been erased and unerased, and I understood that I had spent 3 years married to a man who told me my perfume gave him headaches. And here was a man telling me he'd carry a tray with me, and that the difference between those two sentences was the entire difference between a cage and a life. I keep waiting for someone to take it away, I said. The being seen. My whole family taught me that if people can see you, they can rob you. That's why we buried ourselves. That's the Vance inheritance. I know, David said. But you stood up in a ballroom and unburied it in front of the whole city, because you decided the hiding cost more than the risk. You already made the choice, Nora. You made it for your family's name. He reached over and took my hand, carefully, the way you'd hold something that had spent a long time learning it was safe to be held. I'm just asking you to make the same choice for yourself. Stop burying the one Vance who matters most. Let yourself be seen too. I promise I'm not here to rob you. I'm here to keep watch. I didn't say anything wise. I've told you, I never do, at the moments that actually matter. I just held on to his hand, on the floor of a reclaimed building, under a framed letter from a dead man who'd told me to go and be free. And for the first time in my entire life, I let someone see me without waiting for the cost. There was no cost. That was the thing I'd never believed possible. The thing 3 generations of buried veils had died without learning. Sometimes a person just looks at you clearly and stays. Sometimes being seen is not the beginning of being robbed. Sometimes it's the beginning of not being alone. I told my found family before I told anyone else, because they were the ones who'd earned it. Celeste, who had made a hostile acquirer cry in a deposition, and who, when I said the words out loud, put down her pen and said, "Finally," in the exact tone she used when a deal she'd been grinding on for months finally closed. Leo, who had found the thread that unraveled Camille, and then the thread that unraveled Cross, and who, when he heard, grinned and said, "I ran the numbers on you two 8 months ago. The projection was extremely favorable." And Walker, who had mapped the entire Thorne family's financial network in the dark and never said 6 words about any of it, who looked at me for a long moment and then said quietly, "Good," which from Walker was a wedding toast, a blessing, and a standing ovation all at once. They were the family I'd built in the light, after a lifetime spent hiding in the dark. And they were, I realized, somewhere in the middle of telling them, the actual fortune. Not the fund, not the tower, not the reclaimed name. 4 people who knew exactly who I was, all of it. The hidden fund and the guest bedroom and the plain coat and the ice I'd had to become to survive, and who had chosen, freely, with nothing owed and nothing extracted, to stand on my side of every table for the rest of it. My grandfather had buried our whole family to keep us safe from being robbed. He'd never gotten to learn the thing I learned in that room, that the only wealth nobody can ever steal from you is the people who'd carry the tray. We were married the next spring, small, almost no one. Celeste cried and pretended it was allergies. Walker wore a tie and said 11 words all day, which for Walker was a speech. Leo gave a toast that started as a spreadsheet joke and ended somewhere genuinely moving. I wore my grandmother's pearls, the real ones, the ones a cruel woman had once called cheap, and David looked at me across a very small room the way he'd looked at me across a very large board table, steady and honest and unsurprised, as if he'd known who I was all along. He had. That was the whole point. He'd known before I did. People always want to know what happened to the others. That's the part of a story like mine that feels like dessert. So let me tell you quickly, because none of them are the point anymore, and that's the sweetest revenge of all, that they stopped being the point. The company thrived. That's the boring, beautiful truth of it. Under the Vance name, with David running it and Maya running operations, and a whole executive floor I'd built out of the overlooked and the ignored, the old Thorne Group became something it had never been in 3 generations of golden heirs. Well run. The shipping arm, healthy once the thieves were gone, became the best in the region. The employees whose pensions I'd guaranteed personally in a boardroom kept their jobs and their retirements, and mostly never knew how close they'd come to losing both, which is exactly how I wanted it. You don't save people so they'll thank you. You save them so they get to keep living lives that never had to know they were in danger. That's the difference between protecting people and performing it. And it's a difference the Kingsleys never understood. Beatrice Thorne faded quietly into the smaller life her family's collapse left her. But she surprised me once. A year after the gala, a donation arrived at the Vance Foundation. Modest, anonymous, except that anonymous donations always leave a fingerprint if you know how to look, and this one traced back to the sale of a single piece of jewelry, one of the over-leveraged diamonds she'd worn to 100 parties where she'd looked through me. She'd sold it and given the money to the foundation that finds invisible people, and told no one. I never mentioned it to her. Some apologies are louder when they stay unspoken, but I understood it. It was Beatrice, in the only language she had, saying the same thing she'd said at my office with the pearls. I see it now. I see you. Too late, but real. Arthur lived out his quiet years on the coast and, by the accounts that reached me, actually became a gentler man at the end than he'd been at the height, which is the most any of us can hope for and more than most of us manage. He wrote me one letter near the end. It said only, "You told me the truth when you could have told me nothing, and it was the first honest thing anyone did for me in 30 years. Thank you for seeing me clearly enough to bother." I kept it in the drawer beneath my grandfather's letter. 2 old men, 2 confessions, 1 buried family. The symmetry mattered to me. And Lawrence. I saw Lawrence one last time, 4 years after the morning he told me to take my handbag and go. It was at an airport, of all places, both of us waiting for delayed flights, and I almost didn't recognize him. The golden had worn all the way off. He looked ordinary, finally and completely ordinary. And here is the thing that told me everything. He looked, for the first time in the whole time I'd known him, at peace with it. He was traveling with a woman I didn't know and a small child who had his eyes. And when he saw me, he didn't flinch, and he didn't perform, and he didn't reach for charm that had long since stopped working. He just walked over carefully and said, "Hi, Nora." "Hello, Lawrence." He glanced back at the woman and the child, then at me. "I run a logistics desk now," he said. "Mid-level, nothing special. I'm good at it, actually, which surprised everyone, mostly me." A small, real, unfamiliar smile. Turns out when you take away everything a person was handed, sometimes what's left is somebody who can actually do a day's work. I didn't know that about myself. I hated finding out. And then I didn't. He looked at me, and there was no fury in it, and no begging, just a man who'd been ordinary long enough to have learned something from it. "You were right. At the end, on the sidewalk, I never saw people. I'm learning. She taught me." He nodded toward the woman. "Slower than you would have, but I'm learning." "I'm glad," I said, and I found, to my own surprise, that I meant it, completely, without any weight behind it at all. The splinter was gone. It had been gone a long time. "For what it's worth," Lawrence said, "I'm glad it went to you. The company, the name, all of it. I spent about 2 years being angry, and then I spent about 2 years understanding, and now I'm just glad. Because you did more with it in 4 years than my family did in 60, and the people who work there are better off, and my grandfather's tower is finally run by someone who deserves it." He put out his hand, not to be charming, just, at long last, honestly. "I'm sorry, Nora, for the guest bedroom, for the headaches, for all 1,000 small ordinary days. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was too busy being handed things to notice. I'll regret it for the rest of my life. And I've made my peace with that, because it made me someone who'll never do it to anyone again." I shook his hand. The boy from the balcony was gone, and so was the man from the conference room, and what was left was just a person, at an airport, who'd been humbled into decency. It's not the ending the tabloids would have wanted. There was no ruin, no gutter, no comeuppance to photograph. There was just a man who lost everything and, in losing it, finally became someone worth being. Which is, if you think about it, a far rarer and stranger fate than ruin. "Take care of them," I said, nodding to his family. "See them, Lawrence, every ordinary day. That's the whole thing. That's all it ever was." "I know," he said. "I know that now." His flight was called. He went back to his family, and the little boy with his eyes reached up and took his hand. And Lawrence Thorne, ordinary and unremarkable and finally genuinely present, walked away toward a gate, and I felt nothing but a distant, clean kind of gladness. The gladness you feel when a story you were once trapped inside finally lets its last character go free. I think about that morning a lot, the one this whole story started with. The morning of my divorce, when my husband slid the papers across the table and told me to take my handbag and go, because without him, I was nothing. I've had years to sit with that sentence now. Without him, I was nothing. And here's the strange thing I've come to understand about it. The thing I couldn't have told you the day he said it. Because the day he said it, it still had the power to cut. He believed it. That's what I finally understood. Lawrence Thorne wasn't being cruel when he said it, or not only cruel. He genuinely believed that a woman was made of the man she was attached to, that I was a satellite of his light, that if you removed the Thorne name from Nora, there would be nothing left but a plain coat and a handbag. He believed it because it was the only kind of person he knew how to be. Everything Lawrence was, he'd been handed. His worth was his name, his money, his father, his grandfather's stolen tower. Take those away, and there really was, for a long time, nothing left, which is exactly why losing them nearly destroyed him, and then, eventually, saved him. He was measuring me with the only ruler he owned. He looked at me and saw what he would be without his advantages, and he assumed I was the same kind of empty. He had it precisely backwards, because I was the opposite kind of person entirely. Everything I was, I'd built in the dark, with no name and no credit and no one watching, out of nothing but patience and intelligence and a refusal to be robbed. Take away every advantage I had and you didn't get nothing. You got the whole engine, still running, in the plain coat, holding the handbag, walking out the door to go take back an empire. The advantages were never where my worth lived. They were just the part other people could see. And the part other people could see had always been the smallest, least important part of me, on purpose, by design, 3 generations in the making. Without him, I was nothing. Without me, his entire world was a house of cards with 1 card removed. That's the sentence when you turn it over. That's the whole story in 8 words and their echo. He thought I was the satellite and he was the star. But I was the gravity the whole time, invisible, holding everything in its orbit. And the day he decided he didn't need the gravity anymore, everything he'd ever known simply drifted apart. Because that's what things do when you remove the force that was quietly holding them together. He never even knew it was there. That's the part that still, on certain nights, I find almost unbearably sad. Not that he lost. That he spent 3 years inside the orbit of someone extraordinary and never once looked up long enough to feel the pull. People ask me sometimes, now that the Vance name is back in the light and the foundation is finding buried people all over the country and the tower runs better than it has in 60 years, whether I'd do it again. Whether, knowing everything, I'd marry the golden boy, pour the wine, sleep in the guest bedroom, bleed a fortune into a sinking company for a man who told me my perfume gave him headaches. And the honest answer, the plain truth answer, the only currency I've ever really trusted, is yes. Not because I'd want to relive the loneliness, I wouldn't, but because every buried day of it made me exactly the woman who could walk into a conference room, and then a boardroom, and then a house on a hill to face the oldest king in the city, and win each one not with cruelty, but with clarity. The 3 years in the dark weren't the thing that happened to me before my life started. They were where I learned the only skill that ever mattered. How to be underestimated completely by everyone, and to let it be the sharpest weapon in the room. Lawrence gave me that. Beatrice gave me that. Arthur, with every command to pour the wine, was quietly forging the exact instrument that would one day take his family's tower apart and hand it, gently, to the people who'd always deserved it. So yes, I'd do it again, because the balcony boy who made a hidden girl feel seen for 1 evening was, in the end, worth exactly 1 evening. And the 3 years of pain that followed were the tuition for a freedom my whole family had died without ever affording. My grandfather buried us to keep us safe. It fell to me to prove that we didn't have to stay buried to stay unrobbed. That you can stand in the full light, name and pearls and history and all, and still be impossible to take anything from, as long as your worth was never in the part they could see. That's the Vance inheritance. My grandfather was right about that, right down to the last line of his letter. It was never the money. The money was just how the world finally noticed. The inheritance was the freedom. The freedom to be seen completely and stay whole. The freedom to be handed every reason to become a monster and choose, instead, to become a home for the next buried person who needs one. I keep his letter framed on the wall of a small plain office in a building where my family was erased and unerased. And every morning I read the last line before I start the day. Go and be free, my girl. You have more than earned it. I have. Finally. Completely. Freely. And it started, all of it. The whole reclaimed empire and the unburied name and the foundation and the marriage and the life, on a morning when a man handed me some papers and told me to take my handbag and go. So I did. I took my handbag. And I went and took everything else on the way out. Epilogue. The Girl in the Plain Coat. 5 years after the gala, on an ordinary Tuesday, a girl walked into the lobby of the Vance Foundation in a plain coat. I wasn't supposed to be there. I ran an empire. I didn't work the intake desk. But I'd made a habit, one morning a week, of sitting quietly in the corner of that lobby with a cup of coffee and no title on my chest, watching the people who came through the doors, because every one of them was a version of a girl who'd once poured wine at a party where a cruel woman called her real pearls cheap. David called it my church. He wasn't wrong. It was the closest I came to praying, sitting in that lobby, watching the buried arrive to be unburied. The girl in the plain coat was maybe 23. She had that particular way of holding herself that I recognized instantly because I'd worn it for the first 30 years of my life. The posture of a person who has learned to take up as little space as possible so that no one will decide she's taking too much. She'd folded a piece of paper so many times it was going soft at the creases. She approached the desk like she was braced to be turned away, which meant she'd been turned away from a great many desks, which meant she was exactly who the foundation existed for. I couldn't hear the whole conversation, but I heard the shape of it, because it was always the same shape. She had something, this girl. A patent, it turned out, from the intake notes I read later. A genuinely brilliant piece of engineering she'd developed while working as an assistant, uncredited, for a company that had quietly filed it under someone else's name and paid her nothing and dared her, with the full weight of their lawyers, to try to prove otherwise. She'd spent 2 years being told by everyone that she was nobody, that she had no case, that a girl in a plain coat could not possibly have built the thing that a well-funded company said it had built, that she should take her handbag, more or less, and go. She'd come to us because someone somewhere had told her that there was one place in the city that specialized in exactly this. In finding the people the powerful had made invisible and giving them not charity, not sympathy, but the one thing that actually changes anything: resources. Lawyers as good as the ones arrayed against them. The financial patience to fight a long fight. The refusal to let a person be erased simply because erasing her was convenient for someone with more money. She'd come to us because 60 years ago, a man robbed his best friend and buried a family, and 3 generations later, that family had risen and turned its own wound into a machine for making sure the wound could never be inflicted on anyone else again. I watched the intake officer, a shramp, kind woman I'd hired precisely because she'd once been buried herself, lean forward and say the sentence we trained every one of them to say, the sentence that was the whole soul of the place. I heard it float across the lobby, quiet and enormous. We believe you. Now let's go prove it. And I watched the girl in the plain coat begin, very slowly, to cry. Not from sadness, from the specific structural relief of a person who has spent years being told she is nothing, finally sitting across from someone who can see, at a glance, that she is not. I know that cry. I've cried it exactly once in my life, on the floor of a reclaimed building, holding the hand of a man who told me he'd carry the tray with me. It is the cry of the gravity discovering that someone has finally felt the pull. I didn't go over. That was the one rule I kept, in my church, in that lobby. I never introduced myself. The girls in the plain coats didn't need to meet the woman whose name was on the building. They needed to walk out believing they'd won it themselves, because they would, because that was the entire point. The foundation didn't make people into satellites of my light. It handed them back their own. The last thing a buried person needs is a new star to orbit. What they need is to be told credibly, by someone with the power to make it true, that they were the gravity all along. But I did something small before I left that morning. I stopped at the desk on my way out, and I left a note for the intake officer, and I asked her to make sure the girl in the plain coat got, along with the lawyers and the funding and the long, patient fight, one particular thing from the foundation's account. A coat. A good one. Not to replace the plain one, to hang beside it, so that on the day she won, And she would win. We don't lose those fights. We built the whole place around not losing them. She would have both. The plain coat that taught her to be underestimated, and a coat she chose herself, for standing in the light on the other side. Because that was the thing I understood now, 5 years free, that I could never have told you the morning a man handed me my handbag. The plain coat was never the enemy. The plain coat was the training. Being underestimated was never the wound. It was the weapon, if you lived long enough and stayed sharp enough to turn it. Every girl who walked into that lobby in a coat that made the world look through her was carrying, whether she knew it yet or not, the exact instrument that would one day take apart whatever tower had been built on top of her. My whole life, people confused invisible with absent. It cost every one of them everything. I built a foundation to make sure that, from now on, the invisible would have somewhere to go while they waited to be seen. And that when the seeing came, as it had finally come for me, in a ballroom, in my grandmother's real pearls, in front of a city that had looked through me for 30 years, they would be ready. Not to become a star, to discover they'd been the gravity all along. I finished my coffee. I stood up. I put on my coat, which was, and I want you to understand that this was a choice, and that I make it every single morning, still plain, still unremarkable, still the exact coat that a whole conference room once looked at and decided I was nobody. I've never stopped wearing it. I own 1,000 others. I choose the plain one most days, on purpose, because it reminds me of the single most valuable thing I know, the thing my grandfather buried a fortune to teach me, and a girl in a plain coat had just walked through our doors to learn. The world will tell you that you are nothing. It will tell you at dinner tables and in conference rooms and on the steps of buildings where they sign your erasure. It will hand you your handbag and tell you to go. So take your handbag. And go build the kind of gravity they'll never see coming, until the day everything they own is quietly, completely orbiting you. I walked out of the lobby into an ordinary Tuesday under a gray sky, in a plain coat, the richest and freest woman in the city, entirely unremarkable, entirely unburied, entirely seen by the 2 or 3 people who mattered, and pleasantly invisible to everyone else. Behind me, a girl who thought she was nobody was signing the first page of the fight that would prove she never had been. The name over the door said Veil. We were always there. They just weren't looking. The end.